The heavy oak doors shattered inward with a deafening, apocalyptic crash, instantly silencing the whispers of 500 terrified billionaires. I stood at the altar in a ruined dress, my antique lace veil violently shredded into ribbons by my fiancé's cruel family, when Julian Thorne, the deadliest syndicate boss on the East Coast, stalked down the center aisle. Preston, the coward I had almost married, stumbled backward. The arrogant smirk vanished from his face, draining to a sickly, bone-white panic. "Mr. Thorne," Preston stammered, his voice cracking as he raised his trembling hands in surrender. "Sir, please. What are you doing? This is a private wedding." Julian didn't even look at him. His steel-gray eyes were locked entirely on me. He stopped mere inches from my face, his jaw clenched so tightly a muscle ticked furiously beneath his scarred skin. Slowly, the most feared predator in the city reached out with a trembling hand and gently touched the jagged cuts of my ruined veil. A single silent tear slipped down his cold, ruthless face. "This wedding ends here," Julian commanded, his voice a low, lethal rumble that made the stained-glass windows vibrate. He swiftly turned his murderous gaze toward the front pew. "And anyone in this room who touched what belongs to me will not live to see tomorrow." I thought my life was completely destroyed when the elite tried to break me. But I never imagined the city's most dangerous mafia boss was about to burn their entire empire to the ground just to protect my dignity. If you want to find out how a humiliated, broken bride became the untouchable queen of the underworld, smash that like button, subscribe, and let's dive into the story of the Golden Scars. Some people destroy beautiful things simply because they cannot stand the thought of a nobody owning them. On the morning of her wedding, Elara Vance learned this the hard way. In a room that smelled of imported champagne and bitter resentment. The bridal suite of the Kensington family's sprawling Newport estate was a masterclass in suffocating luxury. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a sweeping, panoramic view of the cold Atlantic Ocean, the waves crashing violently against the jagged rocks below. Inside, the air was heavily perfumed, thick with an unspoken hostility that had haunted Elara since the day she accepted Preston Kensington's diamond ring. She was 27 years old, a brilliant but penniless orphan who had learned the dying art of antique textile restoration at her late grandmother's knee in a cramped, drafty apartment. Her hands, though elegant, bore the microscopic calluses of a working-class artisan's hands that could resurrect fragile fabrics that prestigious museums had long given up on. To Preston, her talent was a charming quirk. But to the rest of the Kensington dynasty, Elara would never be anything more than a glorified seamstress, an opportunistic interloper who had somehow clawed her way into a world of generational wealth she had absolutely no right to touch. For 9 exhausting months, Elara had spent her nights hunched over a work table under the harsh glow of a specialized restoration lamp, breathing life back into a piece of exquisite antique lace. She had found the ruined veil in a damp, forgotten antique shop, spending almost the entirety of her meager life savings to bring it home. She had painstakingly rewoven every torn thread, piece by piece, intending to wear it down the aisle as a symbol of her own resilience. It was a masterpiece, a delicate web of ivory silk that looked as though it had been spun by angels. It was her pride. It was her armor, and now it was gone. Standing over the ruined silk with heavy, silver sewing shears still warm in their manicured hands were Serena Kensington and her mother, Eleanor. Their lips were curled into the deeply satisfied, chilling smiles of privileged women who had never once in their entire lives been told the word no. They did not look at Elara with guilt or hesitation. They looked at her with the triumphant arrogance of predators who had finally cornered their prey. "You really should be grateful to us, Elara," Eleanor said, her voice dripping with a saccharine sweetness that felt entirely cruel. She carelessly dropped the heavy shears onto the marble vanity. The metal struck the expensive stone with a sharp, dry clatter that echoed through the deadly silence of the room. Eleanor dusted off her hands. acting as though she had just been forced to touch something utterly filthy. "We are simply saving you from turning yourself into a complete laughingstock in front of Boston's most decent, respectable people. A girl who scrapes together bits of discarded, filthy fabric like you has absolutely no right to wear something she deludes herself into thinking is precious." Serena let out a shrill, mocking laugh that rang through the tense air. She stepped closer to Alara, invading her personal space. Alara could distinctly smell the intoxicating blend of expensive custom perfume mixed with lingering scent of champagne from the rehearsal dinner the night before. "Listen to me carefully, dear sister-in-law," Serena whispered, her eyes flashing with pure malice. "Preston will grow tired of you soon enough. Kensington men do not stay married to pathetic girls who grew up in cramped apartments without fireplaces. They only play with girls like you for a little while, just to feel rebellious. And then they throw you away when the novelty wears off. You are nothing but an old, discarded thing. You are exactly like the trash currently lying on the floor." The two women exchanged a deeply triumphant glance, a silent confirmation of their absolute victory. Then, moving with the graceful, synchronized motion they had spent their entire privileged lives practicing, they turned on their designer high heels, glided out of the bridal suite, and closed the heavy oak door behind them with a soft, yet devastatingly final click. Left completely alone in the massive suite, Elara slowly sank to her knees on the cold hardwood floor. She reached out with trembling fingers and picked up a fragile, severed strip of the lace. The embroidery she had so patiently and lovingly sewn back together, stitch by agonizing stitch for 9 months, was now violently torn apart. The scraps were scattered across the floor like the dried, dead petals of a crushed flower. This was the peak of her absolute disappointment. A crushing, suffocating weight that pressed down on her chest until she could barely breathe. For one terrifying moment, her throat tightened painfully. Her eyes burned with the threat of hot tears, and she thought she would completely break apart, shattering into a million pieces just as any normal woman would in such a horrifyingly cruel moment. She felt entirely helpless, pinned down beneath the heavy boot of systemic elitism. She realized, with a sickening clarity, that Preston would never protect her from this. He knew exactly how vicious his mother and sister were. He knew their capacity for cruelty. And yet he had left her alone in this room, essentially throwing her to the wolves to preserve his own comfort. The Kensington family did not see her as a human being deserving of basic respect. They saw us as an infestation to be eradicated, her lifelong dream of finally having a warm, loving family, a dream she had harbored since she was only orphan, was nothing but a naive illusion. But as Alara knelt there among the ruins of her life's greatest work, the tears simply did not fall. Instead of breaking, something entirely different rose from the deepest, darkest depths of her chest. It was a sensation cold still, and so terrifyingly clear that it almost made her shiver. A strange profound calm washed over her, a survival instinct forged through years of having to fight for her own dignity in a world that constantly tried to strip it away. She did not cry, she did not run away. She sat there and understood, with absolute, unwavering certainty, that she would not walk down the aisle today to become Preston Kensington's submissive, broken wife, but she also refused to sneak out the back door in tears like a defeated, humiliated woman, which was exactly the outcome the Kensington family was praying for. If they wanted to turn her wedding day into a grand performance of humiliation, then she would give them a performance that would echo through their elite social circles for the rest of their lives. Just then, the heavy oak door opened hesitantly, and Oliver stepped inside. Oliver was the only makeup artist Alara truly trusted. A young man with deeply kind eyes and brilliant hands, who had stayed fiercely loyal to her since her early days struggling to make rent in Boston. He stopped dead in his tracks the moment he saw the shredded lace scattered across the floor. All the color instantly drained from his face, leaving him deathly pale, and he rushed forward, quickly kneeling beside her. "Elara," Oliver whispered, his voice trembling violently with sheer horror as he surveyed the destruction. Oh my God, what did they do to you? Let me call a private car. I will get you out of here right now. You do not have to endure another second of this toxic madness. But Alara only shook her head when she slowly lifted her eyes to meet his. The terrifying intensity in her gaze made Oliver go completely still. There was absolutely no pain left in her eyes, no weakness, and no hesitation. There was only an iron resolve, as cold and unbreakable as a glacier. I am not going anywhere, Oliver, she said, her voice so incredibly even and calm that it sent a chill straight down his spine. She stood up, gathering the torn, jagged pieces of lace into the palms of her hands with the profound tenderness of someone cradling a dying, living thing. She walked over to the vanity and placed the shredded ribbons on the marble in front of him. I need you to help me with one last thing, Alara said, her voice dropping to a decisive whisper. Pin every single one of these torn pieces into my hair. Oliver's eyes widened in disbelief, unable to process what he had just heard. What did you just say? Alara, you can't want to wear it. It's been completely ruined. The entire congregation will see the cuts. Alara smiled faintly. It was a smile completely devoid of happiness, fueled only by cold, unwavering determination. Exactly, she replied, looking at her reflection in the mirror. I want all of them to see it. I want all 500 of the most powerful people in that church to see exactly what kind of monsters the Kensington family truly are. Pin them up, Oliver, and do not hide a single cut. She didn't walk down the aisle as a victim. She walked as a living, breathing testament to their cruelty. St. Cecilia Church was packed tightly all the way to the very last wooden pews. 500 people, representing the absolute apex of the East Coast's elite circles, sat shoulder to shoulder beneath the soaring, majestic stone arches. The air in the sanctuary was thick and almost suffocating, heavy with the overwhelming scent of thousands of imported white lilies and the soft, continuous murmur of privileged, impatient whispers. At the far end of the long aisle, Preston Kensington stood beside the ornate altar, nervously glancing at the absurdly expensive watch on his wrist and exchanging strained, artificial smiles with his groomsmen. In the front row on the right, Serena and Eleanor sat perfectly composed, their backs held proudly straight. They whispered to each other behind expensive silk fans, eagerly waiting for the delicious moment when the humiliated, broken bride would either fail to appear or drag herself out in a pitiful, weeping state. In the shadowy vestibule just outside the main sanctuary, Oliver had accomplished something truly extraordinary. He had handled each ruined, jagged fragment of the torn lace with immense reverence, pinning them into Alara's dark, elegantly styled hair with every single bit of skill he possessed. The ripped strips of ivory silk, with their violently jagged cut edges, flowed down her back like a tragic, mournful spiderweb. It was both deeply heartbreaking and breathtakingly beautiful. It looked exactly like what it was. A brutal, deliberate act of destruction exposed entirely without disguise, pinned directly onto the body of a bride. Are you absolutely sure about this? Alara, Oliver whispered, his hands still trembling faintly as he adjusted the long train of her gown. You really don't have to do this. You can walk away right now. I have never been more sure of anything in my entire life, Oliver, Alara replied, her voice so flat and resolved there was not a single ripple of emotion left in it. Open the doors. The great pipe organ burst to life. It's solemn, echoing opening chords ringing powerfully through the massive church. And the heavy oak doors of the sanctuary were pulled open by the ushers. Azara stepped forward into the center aisle. At once, it was as though the collective breath of 500 powerful people caught in their throats at the exact same second. The polite whispering vanished entirely, replaced by a deafening, stunned silence. Then, a massive wave of startled commotion flared up, spreading like wildfire from one row of pews to the next. As Alara walked slowly and methodically down the long, carpeted aisle, the honored guests leaned completely out of their seats, their eyes widening in sheer astonishment. They were not admiring her expensive gown. They were staring in absolute horror at the violently ruined veil cascading down her back. The deep cuts were painfully clear, the jagged, fraying edges of the antique lace, which had obviously been torn apart with violent force, told the undeniable story of a cruel act of sabotage without needing a single word. A prominent senator's wife in the middle rows raised a trembling hand to cover her mouth in shock. An older billionaire tilted his head, his brow furrowed in deep confusion, whispering urgently into his wife's ear. Somewhere near the back of the church, a camera clicked softly and then quickly fell silent. As though even the paparazzi could not quite believe the sheer audacity of what had just been captured. Alara did not walk like a broken victim. She walked with her chin lifted high, her posture perfectly straight, and every single step steady, measured, and deliberate. She was giving every pair of wealthy eyes in that sacred hall more than enough time to look, to remember, and to fully understand exactly what had happened to her in the bridal suite that morning. In the front row, the smug, triumphant Serena's face suddenly froze, then vanished completely. It was rapidly replaced by a look of wild panic mixed with explosive fury as she realized that everything was slipping disastrously out of her control. She had expected Alara to hide the wounds, to shrink away in deep shame, or to simply wear no veil at all. She had never, in her wildest dreams, imagined that this working-class girl would dare to expose the Kensington family's cruelty before the entire world with such defiant, unyielding pride. Eleanor clutched her silk fan so tightly that her knuckles turned stark white, her face flushing a deep, angry red before draining entirely pale as the searching, judgmental glances of her peers began to burn into the row where her family sat. Through it all, Elara kept walking toward the altar, where Preston stood waiting. His face was growing whiter by the second, his jaw clenched tight against a rising, uncontrollable rage. When Alara finally reached his side at the foot of the altar, Preston leaned aggressively toward her. Through clenched teeth, he whispered in a voice full of pure poison that only she could hear. "What the hell are you doing?" he hissed, his eyes darting nervously around the room. "I told you to take that trash off. You look completely insane. You are humiliating me in front of all these important people." Alara did not turn to look at him. She kept her head lifted high, her gaze fixed straight ahead on the gold cross above the altar. When she answered, her voice was quiet, but every single syllable was as cold and sharp as a scalpel. "I am not humiliating you, Preston. I am simply showing your friends exactly what kind of man you are," she whispered back. A spineless coward who stood by and watched his mother and sister violently destroy something he once swore he treasured. "You wanted me to hide their cruelty to protect your fragile dignity. But I will never hide the truth again, just so a man like you can remain comfortable." Preston went entirely rigid, his face turning from pale white to a dark, furious red, both hands tightening into violent fists at his sides. But he could do absolutely nothing in the crowded sanctuary, surrounded by hundreds of eyes and camera lenses watching his every microscopic movement. Father Donovan, an older priest with silver hair, clearly sensed the suffocating, toxic tension radiating from the bride and groom. Noting the shocking condition of the bride's attire, he cleared his throat loudly, his aged hands trembling slightly as he opened the gold-trimmed Bible beneath the searching, intense gaze of the entire congregation. "Dearly beloved," the priest began, his voice echoing up into the soaring stone arches as he desperately tried to maintain a solemn tone, though his eyes kept involuntarily flicking toward Alara's ruined hair. "We are gathered here today in the sight of God, and before this community, to witness the union of this man and this woman." The ceremony dragged on in an atmosphere so stifling and uncomfortable it was almost unbearable. Elara stood there like a beautiful, tragic statue, completely emotionally severed from the sweating, furious man beside her. Her mind was strangely sharp and brilliantly clear. She was not listening to the religious scriptures the priest was reading, because inside her head she was only waiting for one single, specific moment. She knew that according to the traditional liturgy, There would be a moment when the priest paused and asked whether anyone objected to the marriage. Tiny beads of cold sweat dotted Father Donovan's forehead as he approached that exact part of the ceremony, as though his intuition warned him that something explosive was about to happen. He swallowed hard, his gaze sweeping once across the deathly silent congregation. Then he spoke, his words ringing out clearly. If anyone in this community can show just cause why these two may not be lawfully joined together, he proclaimed, his voice wavering, let them speak now or forever hold their peace. Alara drew in a deep, fortifying breath. She turned her body completely away from Preston and faced the 500 elite guests staring at her. She reached for the massive diamond engagement ring on her left hand, sliding it off her finger with agonizing slowness. She turned and pressed the cold metal flat into Preston's sweaty palm, her eyes locking onto his with absolute, terrifying authority. Then Elira Vance spoke. She did not whisper. She projected her voice so that it echoed against the highest stone arches of the sanctuary, ensuring every billionaire, politician, and socialite heard every single word. I speak now, Elara declared, her voice ringing with the clarity of a struck bell. I am standing before all of you today to state unequivocally that I refuse to marry this man. I refuse to legally bind myself to a family that operates under the delusional belief that their wealth gives them permission to trample on the humanity of others. A person's worth is not dictated by the size of their bank account, the pedigree of their bloodline, or whether they grew up with a fireplace in their living room. True dignity comes from how we treat those we perceive to be beneath us. The Kensington family possesses immense wealth, but they are utterly bankrupt of basic human decency. You can keep your money, Preston, but you will never own my self-respect. Preston flinched violently, as though Ilara had just slapped him across the face with the full force of a physical blow. A massive ripple of utter astonishment spread rapidly through the pews. The very same socialites who had spent the entire morning whispering cruel, elitist jokes about Ilara's poor, working-class background now looked at her with a profound, stunned admiration they themselves had not expected. She had just publicly executed the social standing of one of the oldest families in America. Elara prepared to turn around and walk out the doors on her own 2 feet, completely free. But she never got the chance to take that first step. Before even a single second of silence could pass to absorb her speech, a sound like rolling, apocalyptic thunder broke from the far end of the sanctuary. The 2 massive, heavy oak doors of St. Cecilia Church, banded with thick iron studs, were violently kicked open. They slammed against the stoned walls with enough terrifying physical force to make the front rows of pews actually tremble. The organist jolted in sheer shock, his fingers striking one shrill, discordant note before the sound died abruptly in the tense air. 500 heads whipped around all at once. Striding through the vestibule came 6 men wearing perfectly tailored, pitch-black suits. They moved with a terrifying, military-grade precision and a chilling, synchronized unity. Their cold eyes swept over the panicked crowd, small communication earpieces curling discreetly behind their ears. But it was the man leading them who seemed to suck the very oxygen out of the massive room. Julian Thorne had arrived. He wore a dark, immaculate suit tailored with exquisite, lethal precision down to every last invisible stitch, radiating a kind of overwhelming, oppressive authority that did not need to shout to be heard. His existence alone weighed heavily upon the physical spheres around him. His face was a flawless mask of coldness and absolute command. His steel-gray eyes swept once around the church, and each of his measured footsteps rang across the marble floor with the steady, unavoidable rhythm of a countdown to an execution. He was not an invited guest. He was a violent force of nature that had just kicked its way into a room that was suddenly far too small to contain him. A collective gasp of genuine, primal fear spread through the privileged crowd. The thing that truly froze the air in the church wasn't simply his violent arrival, but the horrifying realization of exactly who he was: the most powerful, untouchable people on the East Coast senators, real estate tycoons, individuals accustomed to giving orders and making others bow, were now the ones who turned stark pale the fastest. Names were whispered quickly, frantically in hushed voices, because Julian Thorne was the man all of Boston feared, the shadow hanging over the docks, the invisible hand guiding the dark currents of money. Eleanor Kensington, who just moments before had been flushed with arrogant rage, was now as white as a sheet of paper, her hand clamped in sheer terror around the arm of her wooden pew. Serena sat totally rigid, her jaw slack, unable to produce a single sound. Julian Thorne did not pause to acknowledge the terrified politicians lowering their heads to greet him in fear. He walked straight down the center aisle, ignoring the entire congregation. At the altar, Preston Kensington looked as though he were on the very verge of fainting. He stumbled backward in total, cowardly confusion, hurriedly bending his head. "Mr. Thorne," Preston stammered pathetically, his voice cracking like a frightened child. In his sheer terror, he completely forgot about the ceremony, his pride, and the bride standing right beside him. "Sir, what an absolute honor. There must be some kind of misunderstanding here." But Julian completely ignored him. He didn't even bother to glance at the groom, treating Preston as though he were nothing more than a meaningless, irritating piece of furniture blocking his line of sight. His eyes, cold and unimaginably sharp, had locked onto one single, specific point from the exact moment he stepped into the sanctuary, and he moved directly toward it without the slightest hesitation. He stopped right in front of Alara. He stood there, towering over her, close enough for her to feel the terrifying, dangerous stillness radiating off his body. For several long, endless, breathless seconds, this entire church fell so dead silent that a person could have heard candle wax dripping onto the marble altar. Julian's gray eyes left Alara's face, lowering slowly, and came to rest on the violently torn fragments of ivory pinned into her dark hair. At that exact moment, something within his ice-cold, impenetrable face cracked just slightly. Julian slowly lifted one large, scarred hand. The motion was so deliberate that the entire church seemed to hold its collective breath as they watched the mafia boss reach out. His long fingers lightly touched one torn strip of the lace hanging beside Alara's face. His touch was incredibly gentle, almost tremulous, as though he were physically touching a sacred holy relic that might instantly vanish with a single hard breath. Then he froze. His hand stopped in midair. His jaw tightened, a muscle along his cheek pulling taut before trembling violently in a way he simply could not suppress. His steel-gray eyes, famously known for never revealing the slightest flicker of emotion before hundreds of powerful people, suddenly darkened with something unimaginably deep, painful, and ancient. It was a profound grief, buried for over 2 decades, that had just been violently awakened by a strip of ruined silk. He recognized it. He recognized every single tiny stitch, every complex pattern of lace worked by hand in a specific, unique technique that he had carved into his memory from the time he was only a little boy. This was his murdered mother's wedding veil, the priceless artifact that had vanished into the criminal underworld, along with her life on that fateful night so many years ago. The very thing he had spent a fortune trying to trace through the darkest corners of the world, only to find it here, violently torn into pieces and pinned into the hair of a defiant, beautiful stranger. For one long moment, so suffocating it seemed totally endless, Julian said absolutely nothing. He only stood there staring at the jagged cuts, the stillness radiating from him more terrifying than any explosive rage could have ever been. Then, a single, silent tear slipped down the stone-cold face of the deadliest man in Boston. Julian slowly lifted his head, his lethal gaze leaving the veil and sweeping across the church, slowly, coldly. That deadly gaze came to rest on the 2 women shrinking into themselves in the front row. Eleanor and Serena Kensington nearly collapsed beneath the sheer, crushing weight of that murderous look. "Close the book, Father," Julian said, his voice low, but carrying all the way to the final pew with a clarity so chilling it sounded like a military command no human being could ever defy. Father Donovan trembled so badly he nearly dropped the heavy Bible, hastily shutting it with fumbling, shaking hands. Julian turned his massive frame toward the congregation, projecting his voice with an absolute, world-ending authority that nothing could shake. "This wedding ends here," Julian declared, the words falling across the silent sanctuary like a death sentence pronounced by a judge. "And so does the Kensington Empire." The heavy oak doors of St. Cecilia Church swung shut behind them, cutting off the suffocating silence of the sanctuary and replacing it with the sharp, biting chill of the Boston afternoon. Alara Vance stepped out into the blinding sunlight. The jagged, ruined strips of the antique lace veil still catching the wind around her shoulders like a fractured halo. Beside her walked Julian Thorne, a man whose very name was enough to make the city's most ruthless politicians lock their doors at night. A fleet of armored, pitch-black SUVs idled on the cobblestone street, their engines purring with a low, predatory hum. Heavily armed men in immaculate suits flanked the vehicles, their eyes scanning the perimeter with military precision. Yet, amidst the overwhelming display of underworld power, Alara felt a strange, profound sense of clarity. For the first time in 2 years, she was entirely free from the suffocating, gilded cage of the Kensington dynasty. Julian opened the heavy, bulletproof door of the lead SUV himself, a gesture of respect that sent a ripple of subtle surprise through his security detail. He did not touch her, nor did he offer a hand to guide her. He simply provided the space for her to step inside on her own terms. Alara gathered the heavy skirts of her ruined wedding gown and slid into the plush leather interior. Julian climbed in beside her, the sheer physical mass of his presence making the spacious cabin feel suddenly intimate. As the convoy pulled away from the church, leaving the crumbling ruins of Preston Kensington's ego behind, the silence in the car stretched out, thick and heavy with unspoken questions. For a long time, Julian only stared out the tinted window, his jaw tight, his broad shoulders rigidly set. The deadly, ice-cold facade that he had worn inside the church had not returned completely. There was a raw, bleeding edge to his demeanor, a vulnerability that he was fiercely struggling to suppress. Slowly, he turned his steel-gray eyes back to Alara, his gaze dropping once again to the shredded lace pinned in her dark hair. "That lace," Julian began, his voice a low, gravelly rumble that seemed to vibrate in the confined space of the vehicle. "You spent 9 months restoring it. Did you know where it came from?" "I found it in a damp, forgotten antique shop in the North End," Alara replied quietly, her fingers instinctively reaching up to brush against a torn edge of the silk. "The shopkeeper swore it had a history, that it belonged to someone of great importance. I bought it because I could see the mastery in the stitchwork. The technique was ancient, something entirely lost to modern artisans. It was beautiful, and it was broken. I wanted to fix it." Julian's chest rose and fell in a slow, jagged breath. "It was not just a piece of lace, Alara, it was my mother's wedding veil." Alara froze, her heart skipping a heavy beat as the gravity of his words settled over her. She looked into the eyes of the most dangerous man on the East Coast and saw the haunted, shattered reflection of a little boy who had lost his entire world. She embroidered it herself. Julian continued, his voice dropping to a whisper that felt entirely too fragile for a man of his reputation, stitch by agonizing stitch, using a method passed down from her own grandmother. To her, it was not merely an accessory. It was a physical manifestation of her love, a legacy meant to be passed down through our family. When I was 9 years old, she was taken from me, murdered, and the veil vanished into the underground black market along with the people who killed her. I have spent 2 decades and tens of millions of dollars tearing this city apart trying to find it, only to walk into a church today and see it shredded to ribbons by a family of arrogant, worthless parasites. Alara felt a deep, piercing ache in her chest. She understood profound loss. She understood the desperate, clawing need to hold on to a physical fragment of someone who was gone. "Julian," she said softly, her voice steady but laced with genuine empathy, "I am so incredibly sorry. If I had known, I would have protected it with my life." Julian looked at her, truly looked at her, his gaze sweeping over her defiant posture, her ruined dress, and the proud, unyielding tilt of her chin. You did protect it, Elara. You wore it like a badge of honor to expose their cruelty. You did not let them erase its worth, or yours. While the armored convoy navigated the winding roads toward the outskirts of the city, an invisible, devastating was being unleashed upon the Kensington family. Julian Thorne did not need to fire a single bullet to destroy an empire. He only needed to make a few phone calls. Within an hour of the cancelled wedding, the invisible threads that had quietly supported the Kensington real estate and shipping conglomerates were violently severed. Banks that had happily extended limitless credit to Preston's father suddenly called in massive loans, citing obscure, newly discovered contract clauses. International shipping partners abruptly terminated their multi-million-dollar contracts without a single word of explanation. The Kensington stock plummeted in a terrifying freefall as panicked investors caught the scent of blood in the water. Invitations to exclusive galas were rescinded. Society doors that had always been held wide open for Serena and Eleanor were unceremoniously slammed in their faces. In a matter of hours, the family that had laughed at Alara's poverty found themselves staring down the barrel of absolute, humiliating ruin. The convoy eventually passed through a set of towering, wrought iron gates, winding up a long, heavily forested driveway until it reached the Thorne estate. It was a sprawling, Gothic-style fortress of gray stone, magnificent yet deeply isolating, radiating an aura of dark, impenetrable power. Julian led Alara into a vast, cavernous dusty lined with floor-to-ceiling bookshelves and a crackling fireplace. He poured 2 glasses of amber liquid, offering her one before leaning back against his massive mahogany desk. "I have a proposition for you, Elara," Julian said, his tone shifting from morning sun back to the authoritative syndicate boss. "My mother's veil is severely damaged, but I watched you trace those threads. I know you have the unparalleled skill to bring it back to what it was. I want you to stay here in my home. I will build you a state-of-the-art restoration laboratory in the East Wing. You will have a limitless budget, access to any material on Earth, and around-the-clock protection. You will never have to worry about money, the Kensingtons, or the cruelty of the outside world ever again. I will keep you entirely safe." It was an offer that would have made any other woman fall to her knees in gratitude. It was a promise of absolute security, infinite wealth, and the protection of a man who could bend the world to his will. But Elara Vance was not any other woman. She had spent her entire life fighting to stand on her own 2 feet, refusing to be owned by circumstance or by the wealth of others. Alara placed the untouched glass of liquor onto a side table. She looked around the magnificent, heavily guarded room, taking in the security cameras, the armed guards stationed outside the reinforced windows, and the suffocating luxury of the estate. Then she looked directly into Julian's eyes, her own gaze unwavering. "No," Elara said clearly. Julian's brow furrowed, a flicker of genuine shock breaking through his composed exterior. "Excuse me, I said no, Julian," Elara repeated, her voice remarkably calm. She took a step toward him, closing the physical distance to ensure he understood she was not intimidated by him. "I deeply appreciate what you did for me in that church today. I appreciate that you stopped Preston from forcing me into a corner. But I did not walk out of one gilded cage just to voluntarily lock myself inside another." Julian's jaw tightened. "This is not a cage. This is a sanctuary. The Kensingtons will undoubtedly seek retaliation for the humiliation they suffered today. Out there, you are vulnerable. Here, you are untouchable. Here, I am your dependent." Elara countered fiercely, her eyes blazing with the quiet, dignified fire that had allowed her to survive the elite's mockery for 2 years. "You are offering to solve all my problems with your money and your power, just like Preston tried to do. Preston thought that because he paid for my lifestyle, he owned my silence. He thought his wealth gave his family the right to strip away my dignity. I know you are not Preston, Julian, but power is a dangerous thing. True power does not mean owning someone, or isolating them from the world to keep them safe. True power is giving someone the space and the respect to stand on their own. Julian stared at her in stunned silence. In his entire brutal, blood-soaked life in the criminal underworld, no one had ever spoken to him with such fearless, unvarnished honesty. Women threw themselves at his feet for a fraction of the protection he had just offered her. Men trembled and offered him their absolute obedience. Yet here stood a woman with a ruined wedding dress and absolutely nothing to her name, rejecting his wealth because she valued her own autonomy more than her physical safety. "I am a master restorer," Elara continued, her tone softening but losing none of its firm resolve. "I will fix your mother's veil because I honor the art, and because I honor what she meant to you, but I will not do it as your pet, hidden away in a fortress. If we do this, we do it on my terms. You will fund a neutral, highly secure studio for me in the city. I will live in my own apartment. I will walk through the front door of my workspace as an independent professional, not as a woman hiding behind a mafia boss. We will have a strict professional boundary. Do you understand me?" Julian looked at her for a long, quiet moment. The irritation he initially felt at being defied slowly melted away, replaced by a profound, overwhelming sense of respect. He had spent his life surrounded by sycophants and cowards. Elara Vance was a terrifyingly beautiful anomaly, a woman forged in fire who absolutely refused to be burned. A slow, rare smile touched the corner of Julian's mouth. It was a smile that transformed his entire face, making him look less like a ruthless syndicate head and more like a man who had finally found a true equal. "You are an incredibly infuriating woman, Elara Vance," Julian murmured, his voice laced with deep admiration. "I will have my real estate team secure a commercial loft in the Arts District by tomorrow morning. It will be retrofitted with military-grade security, biometric locks, and bulletproof glass, but it will be in your name. You will be the sole proprietor. Is that an acceptable compromise?" Elara felt the heavy, defensive tension slowly bleed out of her shoulders. She offered him a small, genuine smile. "That is perfectly acceptable, Mr. Thorne." For the next 2 weeks, the new studio in the Arts District became Elara's sanctuary. Julian had kept his word to the letter. The loft was flooded with natural light, equipped with the most advanced microscopic tools, humidity-controlled archival cases, and rows of pristine workbenches. Oliver, having recovered from the shock of the wedding, joined her as an assistant, bringing much-needed warmth and laughter into the clinical space. Julian visited frequently. Though he strictly maintained the boundaries she had set, he would arrive in the late afternoons, leaving his armed guards in the lobby, and sit quietly in a leather armchair in the corner of the studio. He would roll up the sleeves of his tailored shirts, pour a cup of black coffee, and simply watch her work. They talked for hours during those quiet afternoons. Elara learned about the heavy, suffocating burden of leading a syndicate, the constant paranoia, and Julian's desperate, secret desire to eventually transition his family's wealth into legitimate, clean enterprises. Julian learned about Elara's childhood, her grandmother's strict but loving lessons on thread tension, and the deep loneliness of growing up without a safety net. A slow burn. Magnetic tension began to hum between them, a profound emotional intimacy built on mutual respect and shared trauma. They were two highly guarded people, slowly learning how to lower their shields. Elara had finally found her rhythm. She felt safe, respected, and deeply empowered. She was meticulously removing the damaged threads of the veil, preparing to apply the Japanese philosophy of kintsugi, repairing the broken silk with pure gold thread to honor the scars rather than hide them. Everything was perfectly balanced, until the illusion of safety was violently shattered. It happened on a rainy Tuesday afternoon. Elara was bent over the microscope, her breathing shallow as she concentrated on a particularly delicate knot, when the heavy, reinforced steel doors of the studio lobby were violently banged upon. Before her biometric security system could even register the threat, the glass partitions shattered inward. Boston Police Department. Nobody move. Elara jolted backward, her stool scraping loudly against the hardwood floor. Oliver screamed as half a dozen heavily armed police officers in tactical gear swarmed into the studio. They moved with aggressive, terrifying speed, their weapons drawn and leveled directly at Alara's chest. A smug, heavy-set detective in a cheap suit pushed his way through the tactical officers. He held up a thick manila folder, his eyes gleaming with a corrupt, triumphant malice. Alara Vance. The detective barked, pulling a pair of heavy steel handcuffs from his belt. You are under arrest for grand larceny, art fraud, and the theft of property exceeding $5 million in value. Put your hands behind your back. Alara stared at the handcuffs, the cold, paralyzing grip of sheer terror seizing her lungs. The Kensingtons hadn't just gotten mad. They had weaponized the very justice system itself to destroy her. The cold steel of the handcuffs biting into her wrists was a physical manifestation of her absolute powerlessness. Alara stood frozen in the center of her pristine studio, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. Oliver was backed against the wall, trembling violently. A tactical officer's hand pressed aggressively against his chest to keep him pinned. The smug detective, whose name tag read Miller, swaggered forward, his eyes scanning the expensive restoration equipment with poorly concealed greed. We received a sworn affidavit from Preston and Serena Kensington this morning. Detective Miller sneered, stepping entirely too close to Alara. His breath smelled of stale coffee and cheap tobacco. They claim that the antique lace veil you currently possess is stolen property belonging to their estate. Furthermore, they provided financial records indicating you embezzled heavily from their personal accounts to fund this little business of yours. You're looking at a minimum of 15 years in a federal penitentiary, sweetheart. This was the second peak of her absolute disappointment, a crushing, suffocating realization that the world was fundamentally, irreparably broken. Alara felt the fragile foundation of her new life crumbling beneath her feet. Preston and Serena, fueled by the humiliating destruction of their empire, were striking back with the only weapon they had left: their generational influence over corrupt local authorities. They knew Alara hadn't stolen a dime. They knew the veil was hers. But the truth didn't matter in a system where justice could be bought by the highest bidder. Alara realized with a sickening despair that the wealthy did not need to break the law to destroy someone. They simply used the law as their personal executioner. I have the receipts for the veil, Alara said, her voice shaking despite her desperate attempt to remain calm. I bought it from an antique dealer in the North End. My bank records will prove I haven't touched a single cent of the Kensington money. You have to look at the evidence. Save it for the judge, Miss Vance. Miller laughed, grabbing her by the bicep with unnecessary force. Read her rights and get her in the cruiser. An officer stepped forward, grabbing her other arm. Alara closed her eyes, the humiliating tears she had sworn never to shed threatening to spill. She had fought so incredibly hard to build a life of dignity, to establish boundaries, to prove she could survive without a rich man protecting her. And yet, here she was, being dragged away like a common criminal because old money refused to let a working-class woman win. But just as Detective Miller violently yanked her toward the shattered glass doors of the lobby, the elevator banks in the hallway chimed with a soft, melodic ding. The doors slid open, and the atmosphere in the room instantly plummeted to freezing. Julian Thorne did not step out of the elevator flanked by thugs carrying assault rifles. He did not bring the violent, bloody chaos of the underworld. Instead, he stepped out looking like a lethal corporate emperor, flanked by 4 men and 2 women wearing impeccably tailored, sharkskin suits. They carried sleek leather briefcases and projected an aura of legal authority so overwhelming and terrifying that the tactical officers instinctively lowered their weapons. Julian's steel gray eyes locked onto Detective Miller's hand, which was still gripping Alara's arm. The look on Julian's face was not anger. It was an absolute apocalyptic promise of destruction. Remove your hand from her, Julian commanded, his voice barely above a whisper. Yet it echoed through the studio with devastating force. or my legal team will ensure you spend the rest of your miserable life litigating the loss of your pension, your badge, and your freedom. Miller swallowed hard, his arrogant smirk faltering, but he puffed out his chest, attempting to maintain authority. This is a police matter, Thorne. We have a signed warrant from a judge for her arrest. You interfere, and I'll arrest you for obstruction. A tall, striking woman with razor-sharp cheekbones and a blood-red silk blouse stepped forward from Julian's flank. She did not look at the tactical officers. She treated them as if they were entirely invisible. She opened her briefcase, her manicured fingers pulling out a thick, legally binding document stamped with the seal of the federal court. This was Evelyn Cross, the most feared defense attorney on the Eastern Seaboard, a woman whose hourly rate could bankrupt a small nation. Detective Miller, Evelyn said, her voice dripping with polished, lethal condescension. My name is Evelyn Cross. I represent Ms. Vance. The warrant you are currently waving around was signed by Judge Harold Finch at 9:00 a.m. this morning. However, at precisely 9:15 a.m., my firm filed an emergency injunction with the federal district court, successfully arguing that the affidavit provided by the Kensington family was entirely fabricated. Evelyn thrust a heavily stamped document directly into Miller's chest, forcing him to take it or let it fall to the floor. Furthermore, Evelyn continued, her words firing like precise sniper shots, we have just submitted 60 pages of forensic financial data to the IRS and the FBI, proving definitively that Preston and Serena Kensington have been routing millions of dollars through offshore shell companies in the Cayman Islands to evade federal taxes. The money they claim my client embezzled does not even exist on American soil. As of 10 minutes ago, the federal government has frozen all remaining Kensington assets, and warrants have been issued for their immediate arrest on charges of federal tax fraud and perjury. Miller's face drained of all color, turning a sickly shade of gray. His eyes darted frantically across the legal documents, realizing instantly that the powerful family paying his bribes was currently being dismantled by federal agencies. He was holding a dead warrant, acting on behalf of criminals who were already falling. Now, Evelyn smiled, a terrifying expression that showed all her teeth. You are currently holding my client hostage under a legally void warrant, engaging in the unlawful detention and physical harassment of an innocent woman. You have exactly 3 seconds to remove those handcuffs, detective, before I personally file a civil rights lawsuit that will completely annihilate this precinct's budget for the next decade. The silence in the studio was absolute. The tactical officers slowly backed away, exchanging nervous, terrified glances. Miller's hands shook as he fumbled for his keys. With a sharp click, the heavy steel cuffs fell away from Alara's wrists, clattering loudly against the floorboards. Get out, Julian said softly. The police did not need to be told twice. They scrambled out of the studio, Miller leading the retreat, stumbling over the shattered glass in his desperate rush to escape the wrath of Evelyn Cross and Julian Thorne. As soon as the elevator doors closed behind the disgraced officers, the adrenaline that had been keeping Alara upright suddenly vanished. Her knees buckled. Julian was there in a fraction of a second, his large hands catching her gently by the waist, steadying her against his broad chest. His touch was warm, grounding, and fiercely protective. He didn't say a word. He just held her, giving her the physical support she needed to catch her breath. I thought they had me, Alara whispered into his suit jacket, her voice trembling as the shock finally set in. I thought it was over. They lied so easily, Julian. They just signed a piece of paper, and the police came to lock me away. It was that simple for them. Julian gently pulled back, keeping his hands firmly on her shoulders. His eyes were dark with a sorrowful understanding. He dismissed the lawyers with a sharp nod, and Evelyn led the team out, taking a highly shaken Oliver with them to the lobby to get some fresh air. When they were entirely alone, Julian guided Alara to the small velvet sofa in the corner of the studio, sitting closely beside her. The Kensingtons are a dying breed of old money, Alara, Julian said quietly, his voice a soothing rumble. They have spent generations existing in a bubble where the laws of society apply only to the poor. They view the justice system not as an instrument of truth, but as a weapon to maintain their social hierarchy. When you embarrassed them, when you refused to bow, you challenged their fundamental belief that they are inherently superior to you. They didn't frame you because they wanted the veil back. They framed you to remind you of your place. Alara looked down at her wrists, the angry red marks from the handcuffs still visible against her pale skin. It is terrifyingly unfair. If you hadn't shown up with those lawyers, if I didn't have your protection, I would be in a holding cell right now, facing a decade in prison for a crime I didn't commit, simply because I couldn't afford to fight them. How many innocent people are sitting behind bars right now just because they didn't have an Evelyn Cross to walk through the door? Julian's jaw tightened. Too many. The system is deeply, systemically infected with inequality. Wealth buys innocence, and poverty guarantees guilt. I grew up in the absolute gutters of this city before my uncle took over the syndicate. I saw good. Honest men destroyed by a legal system that punished them for being desperate, while billionaires robbed thousands with a pen and never saw the inside of a courtroom. That is why I do what I do. Elara, that is why I use their own corrupt system to break them. The law did not protect you today. Power did. And I will never apologize for using my power to shield you from their cruelty. Elara lifted her head, looking deep into the soulful, turbulent gray of his eyes. She realized in that moment that Julian Thorne was not a villain. He was a dark knight operating in a world that had completely abandoned the concept of fairness. He was using the shadows to protect the light. A profound, overwhelming wave of affection washed over her, replacing the terror of the morning. "Thank you, Julian," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "You didn't use guns today. You didn't use violence. You fought them the right way." Julian reached up, his large, calloused fingers gently brushing a stray lock of hair behind her ear. The touch sent a violent spark of electricity straight down her spine. "I fight for you any way you require. Alara, you set the boundary, and I will honor it. But you are not fighting this war alone anymore. Do you understand?" Alara nodded, her heart swelling. "I understand," desperate to ground herself, and to replace the lingering terror with the comforting familiarity of her art. Alara stood up and walked over to her primary workbench. The antique lace veil lay carefully spread out beneath the intense, specialized LED lights of her restoration microscope. She needed to lose herself in the threads, to focus on the beauty of the kintsugi philosophy she was preparing to apply. Julian followed her quietly, standing just behind her shoulder, his presence a warm, immovable mountain at her back. Alara adjusted the magnification on the heavy lens, leaning forward to inspect the violently torn edge of a floral motif in the lace. She wanted to map out exactly where the first thread of pure gold silk would be woven to bind the broken pieces together. As the microscopic fibers of the ancient ivory silk came into sharp, high-definition focus, her breath hitched. "Julian," Elara murmured, her brow furrowing in deep concentration. "Look at this." Julian leaned down, his cheek brushing against her hair as he looked at the high-definition monitor displaying the microscope's feed. The floral pattern. Elara pointed a delicate pair of tweezers at the screen. "When I was restoring this the first time, I focused entirely on the structural integrity of the fabric, but looking at it now, under this specific angle of light, the tension of the stitches is completely asymmetrical. In traditional lace making, especially from the era your mother learned, consistency is everything. Every knot should be identical in weight and direction. But here, she moved the fabric slightly, tracing a line of microscopic knots that bordered a torn rose pattern. There are long stitches followed by tight, clustered knots. It repeats, then changes direction. Long, short, short. Long, long, short. Alara's eyes widened, a sudden, electric thrill of realization shooting through her veins. "Julian, this isn't a mistake. This isn't poor craftsmanship. It's deliberate." Julian stared at the monitor, his entire body going rigid. "What are you saying?" Alara, I'm saying it's a cipher. Alara whispered, the magnitude of the discovery making her voice shake. Your mother didn't just embroider a beautiful wedding veil. Julian, she used a complex variation of Morse code, woven directly into the structural tension of the silk threads. She hid a message inside the lace. The silence in the studio was deafening. The air grew impossibly thick. Julian stared at the screen, the realization hitting him with the force of a physical blow. For 20 years, he had believed his mother was a tragic victim, a helpless casualty of the brutal underworld war. But she had been brilliant. She had known the darkness was coming for her, and she had used the only weapon she had, her art, to leave a testament behind. Can you read it? Julian asked, his voice cracking, shedding the last remnants of the mafia boss and leaving only the desperate son. Alara, can you decode it? Alara looked up at him, her eyes burning with an unyielding, fierce determination. She grabbed a fresh notepad and a pen. I am going to read every single word she left you, Alara vowed. We are going to find out exactly who killed her. The illusion of safety in the city had been shattered, and Alara Vance was a woman pragmatic enough to recognize when a tactical retreat was necessary. The near arrest orchestrated by the Kensingtons had proven a terrifying reality. The corruption of the elite knew no jurisdictional bounds. The very next morning, heavily armored SUVs arrived at the commercial loft in the Arts District. Julian Thorne's men, moving with silent, military efficiency, packed up every piece of delicate restoration equipment, every spool of silk, and the violently torn antique veil. Alara watched the city skyline fade in the rearview mirror as the convoy drove her deep into the heavily forested outskirts of Boston, past the towering wrought iron gates, and directly into the heart of the Thorne estate. She was no longer a defiant outsider demanding a neutral boundary. She was a target who had just uncovered a deadly cipher. Julian had kept his promise to build her a sanctuary. The east wing of the Gothic stone mansion had been entirely transformed over a matter of days. It was a sprawling, sun-drenched laboratory with massive arched windows overlooking a private, manicured courtyard. The room was equipped with military-grade biometric locks, bulletproof glass, and an autonomous climate control system to preserve the delicate antique fibers. But despite the fortress-like security, the space felt warm and inviting. Julian had placed a velvet armchair in the corner, identical to the one he had occupied in her city loft, silently promising that the foundation of their professional respect remained unbroken. For the next week, the estate sank into a quiet, intense rhythm. The outside world, with its corrupt detectives and vengeful billionaires, was locked away behind reinforced steel gates. Inside the laboratory, Alara sat beneath the harsh, brilliant glow of the specialized LED halo lights, embarking on the most ambitious and emotionally heavy restoration of her life. She was not merely fixing a piece of fabric. She was resurrecting a murdered woman's final testament. Alara had chosen to employ the ancient Japanese philosophy of kintsugi, traditionally used to repair broken pottery with lacquer dusted in powdered gold. The philosophy dictated that breakage and repair were part of the history of an object, rather than something to disguise. To hide the vicious cuts inflicted by the Kensington women would be a disservice to the veil's history and to Alara's own survival. Instead, she sourced the finest, purest gold silk thread available in the world. As she meticulously aligned the violently jagged edges of the ivory lace, she wove the brilliant, shimmering gold thread between the severed fibers. Every stitch was an act of profound defiance. The gold did not conceal the violence. It highlighted it, transforming the malicious scars into veins of undeniable, breathtaking beauty. Julian spent every evening in the laboratory with her. He had largely delegated the daily operations of his syndicate to his lieutenants, choosing instead to anchor himself to the quiet, methodical rhythm of Alara's breathing and the soft, rhythmic pull of her golden thread through the silk. The air between them was thick with a magnetic, undeniable intimacy. They were two fiercely guarded souls, broken by the cruelty of the world, quietly finding their missing pieces in the silence of each other's company. The gold changes it entirely, Julian murmured one evening, standing close behind her chair. His large, scarred hands rested lightly on the back of her seat. The heat of his body, a comforting weight against the chill of the sprawling mansion. It doesn't look damaged anymore. It looks invincible. That is the entire point of the philosophy, Alara replied softly, her eyes never leaving the microscopic lens as her tweezers guided a fragile thread. The world conditions us to believe that trauma renders us worthless. We are told that if we are broken, we must hide our scars to remain acceptable to society. But that is a lie perpetuated by people who have never had to fight for their own survival. Our scars are our greatest assets. They are physical proof that we endured, that we were stronger than the forces trying to destroy us. By filling these wounds with gold, we are declaring that the damage did not ruin the masterpiece. It elevated it. Julian was quiet for a long time. When he finally spoke, his voice was thick with an emotion he rarely allowed to surface. Do you believe that applies to people? Alara, that someone completely shattered by their past can be put back together. Alara stopped her work. She turned in her chair, looking up into Julian's face. The harsh lighting of the laboratory illuminated the sharp, aristocratic lines of his jaw and the deep, haunting shadows in his steel-gray eyes. He was a man who had been forged in the absolute darkest fires of the criminal underworld. A man whose hands were stained with the sins of a brutal life he had inherited rather than chosen, I believe, Alara said, reaching out to gently touch the cuff of his immaculate suit jacket, that a person's worth is not defined by the violence they have suffered or the darkness they were forced to endure. It is defined by their capacity to seek the light when the storm passes. You are not broken, Julian. You are just waiting for the right kind of gold to heal. A heavy, breathless silence stretched between them. Julian's hand moved slowly, his knuckles gently grazing the soft skin of her cheek. It was a touch so incredibly tender, so completely at odds with his terrifying reputation, that it made Alara's heart ache with a beautiful, terrifying hope. For the first time in his life, Julian Thorne looked entirely unguarded. But the delicate moment was broken by the harsh, digital beep of the decryption software running on the laboratory's mainframe computer. Alara instantly pulled away, her professional instincts overriding the intoxicating pull of his touch. She had spent the last 5 days systematically mapping the asymmetrical, coded knots in the lace, translating the structural tension into a binary format that the computer could analyze. The program had finally finished cross-referencing the microscopic stitch patterns with known historical encryption methods. They moved to the glowing monitors. The screen was filled with cascading lines of raw data, translating the physical knots into Morse code, and then filtering the Morse into phonetic English. The loading bar hit 100%. The screen flashed green. The translated message appeared in plain, undeniable text across the monitor. Alara read the words, and her blood ran absolutely cold. She felt the warmth drain entirely from the room. She did not want to look at Julian, terrified of what this revelation would do to him. The message read, "To my beloved Julian. The shadows in this house are deep. Do not trust the bloodline. The enemy does not breach the gates. He eats at our table. Marcus holds the knife. Forgive me. I love you." The silence that followed was apocalyptic. It was not a quiet absence of noise. It was a heavy, suffocating vacuum that threatened to crush the oxygen out of their lungs. Julian stared at the screen. He did not yell. He did not throw the expensive monitors across the room. He simply stopped breathing. His face transformed into a mask of pure, terrifying stone. Marcus Thorne, his father's brother, the uncle who had taken Julian in after his mother's brutal murder. The man who had placed a comforting hand on a 9-year-old boy's shoulder at the funeral, who had sworn a blood oath to find the killers, and who had ruthlessly trained Julian to take over the syndicate. Marcus was not the grieving guardian. He was the architect of the slaughter. He had orchestrated the murder of Julian's mother to seize control of the family's assets, using the tragedy to mold Julian into a loyal, lethal weapon. "Julian," Alara whispered, her voice trembling. She reached out, grasping his rigid forearm. The muscle beneath his suit felt like solid iron. "Julian, look at me." He slowly turned his head. His eyes were completely hollow, stripped of all humanity. The Dark Knight had vanished, replaced by an apex predator facing the ultimate betrayal. He held my hand, Julian whispered, the words scraping out of his throat like shards of broken glass. He stood over her open grave, held my hand, and told me we would find the men who did it. He watched me bleed for 20 years, hunting phantoms, while he sat at the head of my table. "What are you going to do?" Alara asked, genuine fear creeping into her voice. She knew the laws of the underworld. Blood demanded blood. A betrayal of this magnitude warranted a war that would leave the streets of Boston painted red. Julian closed his eyes, his massive chest heaving as he fought a violent, internal war. He had the power to dispatch a heavily armed hit squad to Marcus's compound within the hour. He could have the man's head delivered in a box by sunrise. But as he opened his eyes and looked at the golden threads shimmering on the restoration table, he remembered the promise he had made to Alara and the silent plea embedded in his mother's lace. "Do not let the darkness consume you. I am going to destroy him," Julian said, his voice dropping to a chilling, calculated register. "But I am not going to give him the satisfaction of a bullet. A bullet is too fast. A bullet makes him a martyr to his loyalists. I am going to take away the only thing Marcus has ever truly loved, his power, over the next 48 hours. Alara witnessed a terrifying display of modern warfare. It was completely bloodless, yet utterly devastating. Julian did not mobilize his soldiers. He mobilized his accountants, his corporate attorneys, and his political leverage. Marcus Thorne had spent the last decade legitimizing his stolen wealth, heavily investing in high-end real estate, offshore hedge funds, and corporate logistics companies. He thought he was untouchable behind the shield of legal commerce. He was wrong. Sitting in the war room of the estate, Julian orchestrated a financial massacre, utilizing Evelyn Cross and a team of ruthless corporate sharks. Julian systematically triggered hostile takeovers of Marcus's shell companies. He leaked highly classified, undeniably damning financial records to the SEC and the IRS, proving Marcus's involvement in massive corporate fraud and international money laundering. He called in favors from senators and federal judges, ensuring that warrants were signed and assets were frozen before Marcus even knew he was under attack. By the evening of the third day, it was over. Marcus's bank accounts were seized by the federal government. His corporate board members, terrified of federal indictment, unanimously voted to expel him. His legitimate empire was reduced to ashes, and his illegal operations were completely exposed to the rival syndicates, stripping him of all underworld protection. Marcus Thorne went from a multi-billionaire kingpin to a hunted, penniless fugitive in the span of a single weekend. Julian had won. He had avenged his mother without firing a single weapon, honoring the boundary of humanity that Alara had shown him. That night, a profound, intoxicating sense of relief washed over the estate. The crushing weight of a 20-year mystery had finally been lifted. Julian ordered the security detail to stand down from high alert, allowing the mansion to breathe for the first time in days. He found Alara in the Grand Library, sitting by the roaring fireplace with a glass of red wine. She looked exhausted, but radiantly beautiful, the golden glow of the firelight dancing across her skin. Julian walked in, discarded his suit jacket onto a leather sofa, and sat down on the thick rug right at her feet. He leaned his head back against her knees, releasing a long, shuddering breath. Alara set her wine down and instinctively ran her fingers through his dark hair, gently massaging his scalp. The simple, domestic intimacy of the gesture was staggering. "It's done," Julian murmured, closing his eyes into her touch. "He has nothing left. The FBI is hunting him. The 5 families have put a bounty on his head for bringing federal heat onto their logistics routes. He is a ghost. It is finally over." "You did it the right way, Julian," Alara said softly, her heart swelling with an overwhelming, consuming love for this man. You proved that you are fundamentally better than the monsters who raised you. Your mother would be so incredibly proud of the man you have become. Julian turned, shifting his body so he was looking up into her eyes. The firelight reflected in his gaze, warm and deeply passionate. I didn't do it alone. Elara, I was drowning in the dark until you walked into that church and showed me what courage actually looked like. You gave me back my mother's voice. You gave me back my soul. He reached up, cupping her face in his large, warm hands. He pulled her down slowly, giving her every opportunity to pull away, but Elara didn't hesitate. She leaned into him, her lips meeting his in as a kiss that was desperate, tender, and deeply consuming. It was a kiss forged in shared trauma and ultimate victory, a silent promise of a future built on mutual respect and absolute equality. For the first time in her entire life, Elara felt entirely safe. The villains had been vanquished. The gold had healed the scars. They had won. The romantic, quiet perfection of the evening wrapped around them like a protective blanket. And then her cell phone rang, the shrill, electronic tone shattered the quiet intimacy of the library. Elara pulled back, slightly disoriented, her cheeks flushed. She reached for the phone resting on the side table. The caller ID flashed Oliver's name. Oliver, Elara answered, her voice soft and breathless with a lingering smile. It's past midnight. I thought you were done packing up the city loft hours ago. There was a horrifying, static-laced silence on the other end of the line. Then, a trembling, terrified whisper cut through the speaker. Elara. Oliver's voice was barely recognizable, choked with tears and sheer, primal panic. Elara, please help me. Someone's here. They locked the doors. They're pouring gasoline. Oh my God. They have guns. A deafening crash echoed through the phone, followed by a sickening thud and a dial tone. The phone slipped from Elara's trembling fingers, clattering against the hardwood floor. The false security of the evening evaporated instantly, replaced by a cold, suffocating dread. The devil wasn't dead. He was just changing the rules of the game. Julian, Elara screamed, the sound tearing out of her throat with a raw, primal terror that made the blood freeze in Julian's veins. In a fraction of a second, the tender lover sitting by the fireplace was gone, replaced by the apex predator. Julian was on his feet before the phone had even finished clattering against the floorboards. What happened? Who is it? It's Oliver, Elara gasped, her hands shaking violently as she frantically tried to redial the number, only to be met with a mechanical voicemail greeting. He's at the city loft. He said someone was there. They locked the doors. He said they had gasoline and guns. Julian, they're going to burn him alive. Julian didn't ask questions. He didn't hesitate. He slammed his hand onto a panic button hidden beneath the mantle of the fireplace, instantly triggering a statewide tactical alert. The heavy oak doors of the library burst open a mere 10 seconds later. Bruno, his head of security, rushing in with a submachine gun strapped to his chest. Mobilize the strike team, Julian roared, his voice shaking the glass in the window panes. Target is the Arts District loft. Full tactical breach. Dispatch the private medical evacuation unit and have the trauma surgeons at Boston General on standby. We move right fucking now. The next 20 minutes were a blur of agonizing, terrifying chaos. Elara was shoved into the back of a heavily armored SUV, Julian sitting beside her, barking rapid-fire commands into an encrypted radio. The convoy tore through the midnight streets of Boston, running red lights, the massive engines roaring like beasts in the dark. As they crested the bridge into the Arts District, Alara's heart stopped entirely. The sky ahead was glowing and angry, toxic orange. Thick, billowing clouds of black smoke clawed their way into the night sky, illuminated by the flashing, chaotic lights of a dozen fire engines and police cruisers. The commercial building that housed her neutral studio, the sanctuary she had demanded to prove her independence, was entirely engulfed in roaring, catastrophic flames. No, Elara choked out, throwing her hands over her mouth as the SUV slammed on its brakes just behind the police barricade. No, no, Oliver. Julian, he was inside. He was just packing up the last of the archival boxes. Julian grabbed her by the shoulders, pinning her against the leather seat to stop her from throwing the door open and running into the inferno. Stay in this car. Alara, do not move. Bruno's advance team was 3 minutes ahead of us. Let them work. Through the tinted, bulletproof glass, Alara watched the nightmare unfold in slow motion. The heat of the fire was so intense she could feel it radiating through the reinforced chassis of the vehicle. Firefighters were desperately spraying massive arcs of water into the shattered, blackened windows of her loft on the 4th floor. But the flames were devouring the old brick building with a ravenous hunger. Suddenly, a heavy, armored tactical van burst through the alleyway beside the burning building, its tires screeching on the wet pavement. The side doors flew open. 2 of Julian's heavily armed operatives leaped out, dragging a limp, soot-covered body between them. They got him. Julian exhaled, a sharp, hard breath. He threw open the SUV door. Medic, bring the trauma kit now. Alara scrambled out of the car, entirely ignoring the chaotic shouting of the police officers trying to hold the perimeter. She ran toward the tactical van, her dress soaking up the dirty water pooling on the asphalt. Oliver lay on the cold ground, surrounded by Julian's private combat medics. He was unrecognizable. His clothes were singed and soaked in blood. A massive, horrifying laceration ran across his forehead, and his breathing was shallow, a wet, rattling gasp that sounded like death. The operatives hadn't just rescued him from a fire. They had rescued him from a brutal, calculated execution attempt. Oliver, Alara dropped to her knees in the dirty street, her hands hovering over his broken body, too terrified to touch him and cause more pain. Tears streamed down her face, cutting clean tracks through the soot and ash falling from the sky. Oliver, please, stay with me. You have to stay with me. Oliver's eyelids fluttered. Through the blood and the pain, his dilated pupils found Alara's face. He reached out with a trembling, heavily burned hand, weakly gripping her wrist. Alara, he coughed, a thin stream of blood spilling over his pale lips. They were looking for the veil, the man with the scar on his neck. He said Marcus sent his regards. He said, they're coming to burn the rest. Shh, don't speak. You're going to be okay. Alara sobbed, pressing her forehead against his bloody knuckles. Clear the way, a medic shouted, as an ambulance finally breached the barricade. Julian's men physically lifted Oliver onto a stretcher, rushing him toward the flashing lights. Alara stood up, her entire body shaking violently, the cold rain and falling ash sticking to her skin. She stared at the blazing inferno that used to be her studio. The realization of what had just happened crashed over her with the weight of a collapsing skyscraper. Marcus Thorne had not been defeated. Cornered, stripped of his legitimate wealth and his political shield, he had not surrendered. He had mutated. He had abandoned the sophisticated warfare of boardrooms and offshore accounts and reverted to the absolute lowest, most brutal violence of the streets. And in his desperation, he had targeted the one person Alara loved most in the world, who was completely unprotected. Julian stepped up behind her, wrapping his heavy suit jacket around her shivering shoulders. He is alive. Elora, the medics have him stabilized. Boston General has the best burn unit in the state. They will save him. Alara turned to face Julian. There was no warmth left in her eyes. The golden, romantic hope of the evening in the library had been incinerated, replaced by a cold, devastating guilt. This is my fault, she whispered, her voice cracking. I dragged him into this. I wanted to be independent. I wanted to prove a point about boundaries and self-respect. And I made Oliver the collateral damage of a mafia war he had nothing to do with. Do not do that, Julian commanded, his voice firm, refusing to let her spiral into self-blame. Marcus ordered this hit. Marcus poured the gasoline. The blood is on his hands, not yours. He is trying to break you. Alara, he is trying to make you surrender the veil and the evidence. I don't care about the evidence anymore. Alara screamed, the raw agony tearing through her chest. I care about my best friend. is uncovering the truth worth his life. Julian, because if Oliver dies, I will never, ever forgive myself. Julian pulled her into his chest, holding her tight as she finally broke down, sobbing uncontrollably against his ruined shirt. He stared over her head at the burning building, his steel-gray eyes reflecting the catastrophic flames. He knew exactly what this meant. Marcus was launching a scorched earth campaign. There were no rules anymore. The next 3 days were a waking nightmare. Elara practically lived in the intensive care unit at Boston General Hospital. Julian had purchased the entire floor, flooding the corridors with heavily armed security guards to ensure Marcus's men couldn't finish the job. Oliver remained in a medically induced coma, hooked up to a terrifying array of ventilators and monitors. The doctors were cautiously optimistic, but the road to recovery would be long and agonizing. Sitting by Oliver's bedside, listening to the rhythmic, mechanical hiss of the life support machines, Elara felt a profound, fundamental shift within her soul. The Kensingtons had tried to destroy her with humiliation and corrupt laws. Marcus Thorne was trying to destroy her with fire and murder. She realized that the world did not reward passive survival. If she hid, if she surrendered, monsters like Marcus and Preston would continue to brutalize innocent people. The only way to stop the darkness was to drag it, kicking and screaming, into the absolute blinding light. On the fourth morning, Oliver finally opened his eyes. He couldn't speak around the breathing tube, but he squeezed Elara's hand. He looked at her, his eyes filled with a desperate, unwavering loyalty, and weakly tapped a single finger against the side of his hospital bed, mirroring the motion of a sewing needle. Finish it. Elara squeezed his hand back, a fresh wave of tears blurring her vision. I will, I promise you. I will finish it. She returned to the Thorne estate that afternoon with a terrifying, singular focus. She marched straight past Julian in the grand foyer, ignoring his concerned inquiries, and locked herself inside the East Wing Restoration Laboratory. She did not sleep. She barely ate. She poured every ounce of her grief, her guilt, and her burning rage into the final stages of the veil's restoration. The kintsugi process was nearing completion. The pure gold threads wove a stunning, resilient web of survival across the ivory silk. It was no longer a damaged relic. It was a breathtaking masterpiece, a physical manifestation of defiance against the cruelty of the world. It was 3:00 a.m. on the fifth night when she reached the foundational hem of the antique lace. This was the thickest part of the fabric, the structural anchor that held the entire delicate piece together. As Elara adjusted the microscopic lens to maximum magnification, preparing to seal the final gold knot, she paused. Something was wrong. She wasn't looking at the decorative, floral patterns where Julian's mother had hidden the Morse code cipher. She was looking at the base structural netting, the absolute foundational layer of the lace that had been woven decades before Julian's mother had even inherited it. Elara's brow furrowed in deep, intense concentration. She used her tweezers to carefully separate a cluster of microscopic fibers. In antique textile restoration, every master artisan leaves a signature. It is an intentional, microscopic flaw, a specific, deeply complex knot or a dropped stitch hidden in the foundational layer that acts as a copyright, proving the authenticity of the piece and identifying the creator. Elara had been taught this secret by her grandmother, who had spent 50 years restoring the most priceless fabrics in the country. Elara increased the magnification, the digital monitor blowing the image up until the individual silk threads looked like massive, intertwined ropes. There it was, buried deep within the hem, completely invisible to the naked eye. It was a triple-looped, inverted slip knot, wrapped over a synthetic blue microfiber that did not belong in a piece of 19th century lace. Elara stopped breathing. The tweezers slipped from her fingers, clattering loudly against the glass slide of the microscope. The signature was completely unique. It was mathematically impossible for it to be a coincidence. It was the exact same signature her grandmother had used on every single piece of fabric she had ever restored. But her grandmother hadn't made the veil. Julian's mother had inherited it, embroidered it, and died wearing it. It had vanished into the criminal underworld the night she was murdered, which meant only one thing. Sometime during the 20 years it was missing, someone had hired Alara's beloved grandmother to alter the foundational structure of the veil. Her grandmother had handled the bloody evidence of a mafia assassination. Alara stumbled backward, knocking her chair to the floor. The air in the laboratory suddenly felt too thin, her lungs burning as she desperately tried to drag in a breath. Her grandmother, the kind, gentle woman who had raised her, the woman who had taught her about honesty, integrity, and the sacred value of art. She was connected to Marcus Thorne. She was connected to the syndicate. The horrifying realization crushed Alara with the force of a physical blow. The absolute worst peak of her disappointment had arrived. Her entire life, her entire moral foundation, was built on a devastating lie. The ghost wasn't just in the stitches. The ghost was in her own blood. The cold, unforgiving floor of the restoration laboratory seemed to tilt violently beneath Alara's feet. She scrambled backward, her breath hitching in her throat as a suffocating wave of panic crashed over her. The digital monitor of the microscope continued to glow in the dim room, displaying the undeniable, magnified image of the triple-looped, inverted slip knot woven over a synthetic blue microfiber. It was a signature as unique as a fingerprint. It was her grandmother's signature. For 27 years, Alara had built her entire identity upon the moral foundation her grandmother had instilled in her. Her grandmother, a woman who lived in a drafty, cramped apartment, had always preached the sacred value of integrity, honesty, and the preservation of truth through art. She had taught Alara that while their bank accounts were empty, their souls were rich. But the microscopic knot glowing on the screen shattered that reality into a million jagged pieces. If her grandmother had altered the foundational structure of Julian's mother's wedding veil, it meant she had touched the bloody evidence of a mafia assassination. It meant she had taken money from Marcus Thorne. It meant the woman Alara loved most in the world was a corrupted accomplice to a monster. The peak of her disappointment was absolute. It was a crushing, agonizing betrayal that felt entirely worse than the cruelty of the Kensington family or the violence of the burning studio. Alara curled her knees to her chest, pressing her hands over her face as violent, silent sobs tore through her body. Her entire life, her craft, and her moral high ground suddenly felt profoundly tainted by underworld blood money. She was paralyzed by a paralyzing cocktail of grief and shame. She had judged Preston. She had judged Serena. She had even judged Julian when they first met. But here, hidden in the very fabric she was trying to save, was the undeniable proof that her own bloodline was complicit in the darkness. The heavy, biometric doors of the laboratory slid open with a soft hiss. Julian stepped into the room, 2 cups of black coffee in his hands. He stopped dead in his tracks when he saw Alara collapsed on the floor, shaking violently in the shadows. He immediately abandoned the coffee on a side table and crossed the room in 3 long strides, dropping to his knees beside her. He didn't ask what was wrong. He didn't demand an explanation. He simply wrapped his massive arms around her, pulling her trembling frame into the solid, grounding heat of his chest. He anchored her in the storm, allowing her to cry until her lungs burned and her tears ran dry. Alara, Julian murmured softly, his large hand gently stroking the back of her head. Talk to me. What happened? Alara pulled back, her eyes red and swollen. She couldn't speak. She simply pointed a trembling finger at the glowing digital monitor. Julian followed her gaze, staring at the magnified image of the microscopic knot, his brow furrowed in confusion. To him it was just another tangled thread in a sea of ivory silk. I don't understand, Julian said gently. What am I looking at? You're looking at a signature, Alara choked out, the words tasting like ash in her mouth. In antique textile restoration, master artisans leave a hidden, microscopic flaw in the foundational netting to identify their work. That triple slip knot over a synthetic blue fiber. It belongs to my grandmother. She taught me how to tie it when I was 12 years old. She used it on every single piece she ever restored. Julian stared at the screen, his mind rapidly processing the tactical implications of her words. Your grandmother restored this veil. Julian, she didn't just restore it. Elara sobbed, the devastating truth spilling out of her. Your mother made this veil. She died wearing it. It vanished into the black market the night she was murdered. If my grandmother's signature is woven into the foundational hem, it means she touched it after your mother was killed. It means Marcus Thorne brought the veil to her. He hired her to alter the structural identity of the lace so it could never be traced back to your family. My grandmother, the woman who raised me to be honest and good, she took blood money to help a murderer hide his tracks. My entire life is a lie. Julian was silent. The revelation was a staggering blow. A bizarre, twisted intersection of their pasts that neither of them could have ever predicted. But as he looked at the devastated woman in his arms, the woman who had bravely faced down an entire church of billionaires and stood tall against a raging inferno, he refused to let her drown in a sea of misplaced guilt. He stood up, offering his hand to Elara, and gently pulled her to her feet. He guided her to the monitor, placing his hands firmly on her shoulders. Look at the screen, Elara, Julian commanded, his voice shifting from the comforting lover to the analytical, razor-sharp syndicate boss. Look at it not as a grieving granddaughter, but as the brilliant master artisan you are. Tell me what you see. Elara sniffled, wiping her eyes with the back of her hand. She forced herself to look at the screen, trying to detach her emotions from the physical evidence. I see her signature, the inverted slip knot. And what is it tied around? Julian pressed, leaning closer to the monitor. A synthetic blue microfiber, Elara replied, her voice shaking. Does a synthetic blue microfiber belong in a piece of 19th century, handcrafted ivory silk? Elara paused. The question cut through the fog of her panic. She blinked, staring hard at the blue thread on the screen. No, absolutely not. It is a glaring, undeniable anachronism. A restorer of her caliber would never introduce a synthetic, brightly colored thread into an antique piece. It violates every rule of preservation, unless, Julian said slowly, his steel-gray eyes narrowing as the pieces clicked together in his brilliant, tactical mind. She wanted it to be found, unless it wasn't a mistake, but a beacon. Elara's breath hitched. She leaned over the console, rapidly typing commands into the decryption software. She pulled up the digital map of the entire veil, cross-referencing the location of her grandmother's signature with the location of Julian's mother's hidden Morse code cipher. As the two maps overlaid on the screen, a profound, chilling realization washed over the laboratory. The triple-looped slipknot was not designed to hide the cipher. It was designed to anchor it. My God, Elara whispered, the color rushing back into her pale face. Marcus brought the veil to her to have the cipher destroyed. He must have figured out that your mother hid a message in the lace. And he ordered my grandmother to dismantle the embroidery and erase the evidence. But she didn't do it. Julian stared at the overlay, his heart pounding with a fierce, sudden awe. She faked the destruction. She altered the cosmetic appearance of the veil just enough to satisfy Marcus. But she secretly reinforced the structural tension of the Morse code. She used that synthetic blue thread as a breadcrumb, knowing that one day, a true master artisan would put this veil under a microscope, spot the anomaly, and pull the thread to unravel the truth. Elara began to cry again. But this time, the tears were not born of shame. They were tears of overwhelming pride, of immense, staggering relief. Her grandmother had not been a corrupted accomplice. She had been a captive who had looked a terrifying mafia boss in the eye and quietly, brilliantly, defied him. She had risked her own life, knowing that if Marcus ever discovered her deception, he would kill her without hesitation. She had preserved the evidence of a murdered woman so that justice might one day be served. She was a hero, Elara sobbed, pressing her hands against the glass of the monitor. She knew exactly what she was doing. She saved your mother's voice. Julian stepped behind her, wrapping his arms around her waist and resting his chin on her shoulder. The profound weight of generational trauma. The heavy, suffocating chains of the past suddenly felt a little lighter. We are not the sins of our ancestors, Ilara, Julian said, his voice rumbling deep in his chest, delivering a powerful, healing truth. For 20 years, I believed I was destined to be a monster because I was raised by one. You believed your legacy was tainted because of a lie. But we have the human right to choose our own moral path. We are not bound by the darkness. Your grandmother chose the light. In the absolute most dangerous circumstances imaginable, she chose to protect the truth. And we are going to honor her courage. Julian turned Alara around, looking deeply into her tear-filled eyes. Package the decryption data. Print every single microscopic scan, every phonetic translation, and the structural analysis of your grandmother's preservation work. Put it in a secure briefcase. What are you going to do? Elara asked, her heart racing as she saw the lethal, uncompromising determination in Julian's eyes. I am going to finish the game, Julian stated coldly. Marcus burned your studio. He nearly killed Oliver. He thinks because he is stripped of his legitimate wealth, he can hide in the shadows and wage a guerrilla war. He thinks I will send my soldiers to gun him down in the streets like a common thug. But I am not going to give him a mafia execution. I am going to give him a federal indictment. 2 hours later, Julian Thorne walked into a highly classified, subterranean parking garage beneath the Federal Bureau of Investigation's Boston field office. He was entirely alone, unarmed, carrying nothing but a sleek titanium briefcase. Waiting for him in the shadows between two concrete pillars was Special Agent in Charge Thomas Vance, the head of the Organized Crime Task Force. Vance had spent 15 years trying to build a RICO case against the Thorne Syndicate, only to be outmaneuvered at every turn. Seeing Julian willingly walk into federal territory was a sight he never thought he would witness. You're a long way from your fortress, Thorne Agent Vance said gruffly, his hand resting instinctively on his holstered weapon. You know I could arrest you right now just on general principle. You could, Julian replied smoothly, his demeanor impossibly calm. But if you arrest me, you lose the biggest career-making bust of the century. You have spent a decade chasing my shadow, Agent Vance. But you have been chasing the wrong Thorne. Julian placed the titanium briefcase on the hood of a nearby unmarked sedan and popped the locks. He opened it, revealing hundreds of pages of highly classified offshore banking records, encrypted communication logs, and the painstakingly translated Morse code cipher that definitively linked Marcus Thorne to a massive string of murders, extortion rings, and international smuggling routes. It was the holy grail of organized crime evidence. It was an airtight, irrefutable death sentence for Marcus's criminal empire. Marcus Thorne orchestrated the assassination of his own sister-in-law 20 years ago, Julian said, his voice echoing coldly in the concrete garage. He has been using the syndicate as a front for a massive human trafficking and narcotics ring out of the Eastern Seaboard operations I strictly forbade, which he ran behind my back. This briefcase contains everything you need to secure a federal judge's signature for a no-knock raid on his current fortified compound in the Berkshires. Bank records, wire transfers, and the physical location of his hidden armories. It is entirely handed to you on a silver platter. Agent Vance stared at the documents, his eyes widening in sheer disbelief as he flipped through the pages. The evidence was pristine. It was legally acquired, forensically sound, and absolutely devastating. Why are you doing this? You're handing over your own uncle. You're exposing the underbelly of your own family's operations. The 5 families will brand you a traitor. You'll be marked for death. Julian looked at the federal agent, his steel-gray eyes devoid of any fear. He thought of Alara, sitting safely in the laboratory, her brilliant hands weaving gold into shattered silk. He thought of Oliver, fighting for his life in a hospital bed because of Marcus's cruelty. He thought of his mother, whose voice had finally been heard after 2 decades of silence. I am doing this because I am breaking the cycle, Julian answered, his voice ringing with absolute, unwavering conviction. I am dismantling the darkness from the inside out. Marcus Thorne believes that power gives him the right to act with total impunity. He believes human lives are nothing but collateral damage in his pursuit of control. I am proving him wrong. You have the evidence, Agent Vance. Now go do your job and get that monster off my streets. Julian turned and walked out of the garage, leaving the stunned federal agent staring at the blueprint of a mafia empire's destruction. The Dark Knight had just handed the sword of justice to the law. The endgame had officially begun. The raid happened in the terrifying, pitch-black hours of the early morning. Julian and Alara sat in the command center of the Thorne estate, surrounded by glowing monitors intercepting the encrypted police scanner frequencies. They did not need to be physically present in the Berkshires to watch the absolute annihilation of Marcus Thorne. Federal tactical teams, backed by armored personnel carriers and heavily armed helicopters, breached the perimeter of Marcus's hidden compound with overwhelming apocalyptic force. The element of surprise was total. Marcus's loyalists, expecting a chaotic retaliation from Julian's mafia soldiers, were completely unprepared for the surgical, highly coordinated strike of a federal task force. Over the audio feeds, Elara listened to the chaotic shouting, the concussive blasts of flashbang grenades, and the panicked screams of men realizing their empire was collapsing. Within 45 minutes, the compound was secured. News helicopters, tipped off by the FBI, circled overhead, broadcasting the historic bust live on every major morning network. Elara watched the massive television screen mounted on the wall of the command center. The high-definition footage showed a pair of federal agents violently dragging a man out of the smoking ruins of the compound. It was Marcus Thorne. His expensive, bespoke suit was torn and covered in dust. His hands were heavily shackled behind his back, and his face was twisted into a mask of pure, humiliated rage. He was not dying a glorious mafia martyr in a hail of bullets. He was being paraded in front of the entire world as a common, defeated criminal. He was being stripped of his dignity, his power, and his freedom in front of millions of viewers. He's gone, Elara whispered, her hand gripping Julian's tightly. The physical relief was so intense it made her lightheaded. He can't hurt anyone ever again. Julian stared at the screen, watching the man who had murdered his mother be shoved unceremoniously into the back of a heavily armored federal transport van. There was no joy in his heart, no triumphant celebration. There was only a profound, hollow quiet, the silence of a battlefield after the final shot has been fired, the heavy, suffocating shadow that had hung over his soul for 20 years had finally dissolved. "It's over," Julian said, his voice steady and remarkably calm. He turned his hand over, intertwining his fingers with Alara's, anchoring himself to the warmth of her pulse. "The FBI has him dead to rights. The evidence is airtight. He will die in a federal supermax penitentiary, entirely alone, and completely forgotten." The days that followed the raid were a blur of brilliant, golden light. With the threat of Marcus permanently neutralized, the suffocating lockdown on the estate was lifted. Oliver, displaying a miraculous resilience, was finally transferred out of the intensive care unit when Elara visited him, showing him the news clippings of Marcus's humiliating arrest. Oliver managed a weak, lopsided smile through his bandages, squeezing her hand in silent victory. The Kensingtons were completely bankrupt, currently facing their own federal indictments for tax fraud. The villains had been systematically, legally dismantled. In the quiet sanctuary of the East Wing laboratory, Elara finally reached the end of her monumental task. Sitting beneath the halo lights, she carefully threaded the needle with the last strand of pure gold silk. She guided the needle through the delicate, antique ivory lace, pulling the thread taut to seal the final kintsugi knot. She snipped the excess thread with a pair of tiny silver scissors. It was finished. Julian stepped up beside her, his breath catching in his throat as he looked down at the table. The veil was no longer the violently shredded, tragic piece of fabric that Elara had worn into the church months ago. It was a staggering, breathtaking masterpiece of human resilience. The gold threads ran fiercely through the ivory lace, highlighting the scars rather than hiding them. It looked as though the fabric had been struck by lightning and survived. It was a physical testament to endurance, a beautiful, undeniable proof that something could be violently torn apart by malice and yet rise again, more magnificent and powerful than it was before. "It's the most beautiful thing I have ever seen," Julian murmured, his eyes suspiciously bright. He was not just looking at his mother's legacy, he was looking at a reflection of Alara's soul. "It belongs to the world now," Alara said, looking up at him with a radiant, hopeful smile. "We can't hide it in a vault." "Julian, this veil tells a story about surviving the absolute worst of humanity and choosing to heal. People need to see it. They need to know that they are not defined by the violence inflicted upon them." Julian agreed completely. They began planning a massive, highly publicized charity exhibition. Julian utilized his remaining legitimate corporate contacts to secure the grand ballroom of the Boston Museum of Fine Arts. The event would not only serve to publicly unveil the restored kintsugi masterpiece, but it would mark a historic transition. Julian was officially liquidating his vast syndicate holdings. He was establishing a multi-million-dollar foundation dedicated to providing legal aid, financial support, and protection for victims of organized crime and systemic corruption. He was now turning his family's blood money into a shield for the innocent. The night before the grand exhibition, the Thorne estate was remarkably quiet. A heavy, torrential rainstorm battered the stone walls of the mansion, the rhythmic drumming of the rain against the glass providing a soothing, deeply domestic soundtrack. Most of the security detail had been given the night off, leaving only a skeletal crew to monitor the perimeter. The threat was gone. Marcus was locked away in federal custody. They were entirely, undeniably safe. Julian and Alara were in the grand library, sitting on the thick rug before the roaring fireplace. They were exhausted, drained from weeks of intense planning. But they were deeply, profoundly happy. Alara rested her head against Julian's chest, listening to the strong, steady beat of his heart. She had never felt so secure. She had walked through the fire, defied billionaires, outsmarted assassins, and had found an incredible, unconditional love with a man who respected her autonomy as much as he cherished her safety. "Tomorrow," Julian said softly, his fingers tracing lazy, soothing circles on her arm, "the entire world is going to see your genius. They are going to look at that veil and know that Alara Vance is a master artisan who refuses to be broken." "Tomorrow," Alara replied, tilting her head up to press a soft kiss against his jaw. "The world is going to see that Julian Thorne is not a monster. They are going to see a man who chose humanity over vengeance." Julian smiled, a genuine, warm expression that reached his eyes. He leaned down to capture her lips, the kiss deepening, filled with the promise of a peaceful, brilliant future. The horrors of the past were firmly locked away. The false security settled over them like a thick, comfortable blanket, and then, with a sharp, terrifying crack that echoed through the mansion, the lights went out. The grand library was instantly plunged into absolute, pitch-black darkness. The ambient hum of the estate's massive climate control system ground to a sudden, chilling halt. The only light remaining was the dim, flickering orange glow of the dying embers in the fireplace, casting long, sinister shadows across the bookshelves. Alara gasped, sitting up straight. "Julian, did the storm knock out the power grid?" Julian did not answer immediately. His body went entirely rigid, the relaxed lover vanishing in a millisecond, replaced instantly by the lethal, hyper-vigilant syndicate boss. His eyes adjusted rapidly to the dark, scanning the room for any thermal anomalies. "The storm didn't do this," Julian whispered, his voice dangerously low. He smoothly reached behind his back, his hand wrapping around the cold steel grip of the concealed firearm tucked into his waistband. "The estate is running on a localized, subterranean nuclear battery. Even if the entire city grid failed, the mansion's power wouldn't even blink. And if there was a catastrophic hardware failure, the diesel backup generators are programmed to engage automatically within 3 seconds." Alara's heart began to hammer violently against her ribs. She counted silently in her head. 5 seconds. 10 seconds. 15 seconds. The backup generators did not kick in. The estate remained completely dead. Someone manually bypassed the failsafes, Julian stated, the terrifying reality setting in. Someone severed the main conduit from the inside, but Marcus is in federal prison, Alara whispered, panic clawing at her throat. The syndicate is dismantled. Who could possibly bypass your security? Before Julian could answer, the heavy oak doors of the library slowly creaked open. The sound was agonizingly loud in the silent, dark house. A tall, broad-shouldered silhouette stood in the doorway, illuminated only by the faint flashes of lightning outside the windows. It was Bruno, Julian's absolute most trusted lieutenant, the head of his security detail, the man who had pulled Oliver from the burning building. Bruno stood perfectly still in the darkness. He did not call out to Julian to report the power failure. He did not ask if they were safe. Instead, the unmistakable metallic clack-clack of an assault rifle being racked, loaded a live round into the chamber, echoed through the room. Julian's blood ran colder than ice. The ultimate checkmate had been played. Marcus Thorne had not been acting alone. He had spent 20 years planting his roots deep into the foundation of Julian's empire. He had known the FBI raid was a possibility, and he had left a sleeper agent, a corrupted, highly paid inside man to execute the final contingency plan. The call wasn't just coming from inside the house. The man holding the gun was the one Julian had trusted to guard the door. "Get down," Julian roared, grabbing Alara by the waist and violently tackling her to the floor, just as the library erupted in deafening, blinding automatic gunfire. The deafening roar of automatic gunfire shattered the peaceful sanctity of the grand library. The muzzle flashes strobing like violent lightning in the pitch-black room. Julian Thorne did not hesitate for a fraction of a second. Before the first bullet could even tear through the expensive leather of the sofa they had just been sitting on, Julian's massive arms wrapped around Alara's waist, violently tackling her to the hardwood floor. The air above them practically hissed as a relentless barrage of high-caliber rounds shredded the antique bookshelves, sending thousands of razor-sharp wood splinters and shredded paper raining down upon their heads. The deafening noise was absolute, a concussive force that made Alira's ears ring in high-pitched agony. She was pinned beneath the heavy, solid weight of Julian's body, his broad chest acting as a human shield against the apocalyptic storm of bullets. Bruno's betrayal was not just a tactical breach. It was a devastating, psychological knife to the heart. This was the man who had guarded Julian's life for over a decade, the man who had pulled Oliver from the burning studio. But in the ruthless world of the syndicate, loyalty was often just a commodity waiting for the right bidder. And Marcus Thorne had always possessed limitless reserves of dark money. As the first magazine clicked empty, the sudden, terrifying silence in the library was broken only by the sound of Bruno smoothly slamming a fresh magazine into his assault rifle. "I am sorry, Julian." Bruno's voice echoed in the dark, cold and devoid of any genuine remorse. But Marcus made an offer that guaranteed my retirement, and the federal transport van was surprisingly easy to intercept on a dark highway. Marcus was free. The realization hit Alara with a suffocating wave of pure terror. The federal arrest had not been the end of the war. It had merely been a temporary inconvenience for a man who owned the very shadows of the city. Julian did not waste breath on a response. In the split second it took Bruno to rack the bolt of his rifle, Julian drew the heavy, matte black pistol from his waistband, without even rising from the floor, relying entirely on his lethal muscle memory and the spatial awareness of his own home. Julian fired 3 rapid shots into the dark, aiming directly at the doorway. A sharp grunt of pain echoed through the hall as one of the bullets found its mark, clipping Bruno's heavy tactical vest and forcing the traitor to dive behind the thick marble doorframe for cover. "Move," Julian roared, hauling Alara to her feet. He kept his body firmly positioned between her and the doorway, providing suppressing fire as he dragged her toward the rear of the library. His hand fumbled blindly along the ornate wooden paneling of the back wall until his fingers caught the edge of a hidden latch. With a harsh shove, a section of the bookshelf swung inward, revealing the yawning, pitch-black abyss of a secret servants' corridor that had been built into the Gothic architecture a century ago. Julian shoved Alara into the narrow passageway, stepping in right behind her and slamming the heavy wooden panel, shut just as another volley of automatic fire chewed through the spot where they had just been standing. The secret corridor was suffocatingly tight, smelling of ancient dust, damp stone, and the sharp, metallic tang of adrenaline. It was absolutely devoid of light, forcing them to navigate by touch. Julian gripped Alara's hand, his fingers bruising in their intensity, and pulled her forward into the labyrinth, outside the walls. They could hear the terrifying sounds of the estate being overrun. Heavy combat boots stomped across the hardwood floors, doors were kicked off their hinges, and men shouted tactical commands. Marcus had not sent a hit squad, he had sent a small mercenary army. "We need to get to the subterranean vault," Julian whispered, his breath hot and ragged against Alara's ear as they moved swiftly through the dark. "The textile archive beneath the east wing. It is encased in 3 feet of solid titanium and reinforced concrete. It has an independent closed-circuit oxygen supply and a localized distress beacon that beams directly to the FBI task force. If we can lock the vault door, they cannot reach us, Julian." "He escaped," Alara choked out, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. "Marcus is out. He corrupted Bruno. They're going to burn this entire house to the ground. I will not let them touch you." Julian vowed, his voice a low, fierce rumble that vibrated with absolute certainty. "Keep moving." They navigated the twisting, narrow corridors for what felt like an eternity. Descending deeper into the foundation of the massive estate, the air grew significantly colder, biting through Alara's thin silk dress. As they reached the heavy iron door that led out of the secret passageways and into the subterranean basement corridors, Julian pressed his hand against Alara's chest, signaling her to stop. He pressed his ear against the cold iron, listening intently. The basement was ominously quiet. He slowly pushed the door open, leading them out into the dimly lit concrete hallway that stretched toward the East Wing vault, but the silence was a trap. As they stepped into the corridor, the emergency red lighting flickered on, casting a bloody, hellish glow across the concrete walls. Standing 30 feet away, blocking the path to the vault, were 4 heavily armed mercenaries wearing night vision goggles and tactical body armor. At the center of the group stood Bruno, his left arm bleeding heavily from Julian's earlier shot. His face twisted into a mask of pure, humiliated rage. "End of the line, boss," Bruno sneered. Raising his rifle, Julian reacted with terrifying, superhuman speed. He shoved Alara violently behind a thick concrete support pillar just as the mercenaries opened fire. The deafening roar of the weapons in the confined concrete hallway was apocalyptic. Bullets struck the pillar, sending massive chunks of pulverized concrete and sting dust flying into Alara's face. She screamed, covering her head as the world exploded around her. Julian leaned out from behind the cover, returning fire with lethal, calculated precision. 2 of the mercenaries dropped instantly, Julian's bullets finding the unprotected gaps in their heavy armor, but he was drastically outgunned. As Julian shifted his stance to take aim at Bruno, a high-caliber round tore straight through the edge of the concrete pillar. The bullet struck Julian in the upper right shoulder with the sickening, heavy sound of tearing flesh and shattering bone. The impact spun his massive frame backward, slamming him brutally against the concrete wall. A sharp, guttural groan tore from his throat, his pistol slipping from his bloodied fingers and clattering across the floor. "Julian," Alara screamed, completely ignoring the active gunfire. She threw herself out from behind the pillar, grabbing his ruined suit jacket and dragging his heavy body back into the cover of the concrete column. Julian's white shirt was already rapidly turning a dark, slick crimson, the blood pouring freely from the massive exit wound near his collarbone. His skin had gone deathly pale, his chest heaving as he fought against the paralyzing shock of the catastrophic trauma. "Leave me," Julian gasped. His teeth gritted in absolute agony. He reached with his good hand, smearing blood across Ilara's pale cheek as he desperately tried to push her away. "The vault. It's 10 yards behind you. Run, Ilara. The biometric scanner will recognize your handprint. Lock the door. Run, I am not leaving you," Ilara sobbed, her hands slick with his blood as she desperately pressed her palms against the gaping wound, trying to staunch the terrifying arterial flow. "I am not letting you die down here," before Julian could force her away. The deafening gunfire suddenly ceased. The heavy, echoing footsteps of combat boots slowly approached their position. Ilara looked up, paralyzed by terror, as Bruno stepped around the edge of the concrete pillar, his assault rifle leveled directly at her head. Behind him, the two surviving mercenaries flanked the corridor, their weapons trained on Julian's bleeding form. How remarkably poetic. A new voice echoed down the concrete hallway. It was a smooth, cultured, and deeply arrogant voice that made Ilara's blood run entirely cold. Marcus Thorne stepped out of the shadows. He looked completely different from the humiliated, dusty man who had been dragged out of his compound by federal agents. He was wearing an immaculate, tailored black overcoat, his silver hair perfectly combed. He looked like a king who had successfully reclaimed his throne. He carried a heavy, polished silver lighter in his hand, casually flipping the lid open and shut with a sharp, metallic clink. "I must admit, Julian, you played a brilliant game," Marcus said smoothly, stepping over the bodies of his fallen mercenaries without a single glance. He stopped a few feet away, looking down at his bleeding nephew with a gaze entirely devoid of human empathy. "The offshore accounts, the SEC leaks, the federal raid. You nearly destroyed everything I spent 20 years building, but you made one fatal miscalculation. You assumed that the federal government was incorruptible. $1 million deposited into the correct offshore account can blind a federal transport driver long enough for a coordinated ambush." Julian coughed, a fine mist of blood spraying from his lips. He glared up at his uncle, his gray eyes burning with an unyielding, ferocious hatred that transcended his physical pain. "You are a dead man walking. Marcus, the entire FBI is hunting you." "Let them hunt." Marcus chuckled, a dry, rasping sound. "With the funds I have stashed in Zurich, I will vanish like a ghost. But before I leave this country, I had to ensure that the loose ends were properly tied." Marcus's cold, reptilian eyes shifted from Julian to Ilara. A cruel, vicious smile curled across his lips. "And you must be Ilara Vance, the brilliant little seamstress who caused all of this trouble. I burned your studio to the ground, and yet here you are, still playing the defiant heroine. I suppose I should thank you. Without your meddling, Julian might have remained a manageable nuisance. You are a monster." Ilara spat, her voice shaking with rage and terror, her hands still desperately pressing against Julian's bleeding shoulder. "You killed your own family for money." Marcus's smile vanished, his eyes darkening into twin voids of malice. He gestured sharply to his mercenaries. "Take her and secure the veil from the laboratory." "No," Julian roared, a massive, primal sound of pure desperation. He lunged forward, trying to throw his massive, bleeding body over Ilara to protect her. But the catastrophic blood loss had robbed him of his strength. Bruno stepped forward and delivered a brutal, merciless kick directly to Julian's wounded shoulder. Julian collapsed against the concrete, the agonizing pain finally pulling him into the dark void of unconsciousness. "Julian," Ilara screamed, fighting with every ounce of her strength as the two massive mercenaries grabbed her arms, violently ripping her away from Julian's body. She kicked, she bit, she thrashed wildly. But it was entirely useless against the armored men. They dragged her backward down the corridor, her heels scraping uselessly against the concrete. "Leave him," Marcus commanded coldly as Bruno raised his rifle to deliver a killing shot to Julian's head. "Let him bleed out in the dark, surrounded by the ruins of his precious estate. It is a far more fitting end for a traitor." Marcus turned his back on his dying nephew. casually flipping his silver lighter open. The flame illuminated his cruel face in the dark corridor, as the mercenaries brutally dragged a screaming, thrashing Alara up the stairs and into the stormy night. She watched Julian's motionless, blood-soaked body fade into the pitch-black shadows of the subterranean basement. Heaven had collapsed into hell in a matter of seconds, and the dark night had finally fallen. The heavy, metallic clank of a rusty iron chain echoing against damp concrete was the first thing that pulled Alara from the suffocating darkness. She gasped, her lungs expanding painfully as she forced her heavy eyelids open. Her head throbbed with a sickening, rhythmic agony, the lingering result of a brutal blow to the temple she had received while fighting the mercenaries in the transport van. The air around her was freezing, smelling heavily of mold, salt water, and ancient dust. She was sitting on a cold, filthy concrete floor. Her wrists were bound tightly together by a pair of heavy industrial zip ties, chained to a thick, rusted iron pipe that ran vertically up the damp brick wall. The space was cavernous and deeply shadowed, illuminated only by the faint, eerie glow of moonlight filtering through her series of high, shattered skylights. Stacks of rotting wooden crates and discarded furniture loomed in the darkness like silent, towering monsters. It took her disoriented mind a few seconds to recognize the environment, but when she did, a profound, chilling sense of dread washed over her. It was the abandoned harbor warehouse in the North End. It was the exact same building that housed the forgotten antique shop where she had purchased Julian's mother's veil years ago. Marcus Thorne had brought her back to the very place where this entire nightmare had begun. "Ah, you are finally awake." Marcus's smooth, cultured voice drifted out of the shadows. He stepped into the moonlight, dragging a heavy wooden chair across the concrete floor. He sat down directly in front of her, crossing his legs with an air of casual, arrogant superiority. Resting on a small wooden crate beside him was the kintsugi veil. The pure gold threads shimmered brilliantly even in the dim light. A breathtaking masterpiece of survival resting in the absolute heart of darkness. "It really is a remarkable piece of work, Miss Vance," Marcus said casually, leaning forward to inspect the gold silk. "I must commend your talent. My sister-in-law was a brilliant woman, but you have elevated her morbid little testament into genuine high art. It is almost a tragedy that I have to destroy it, but I simply cannot leave physical evidence of my past lying around for the FBI to discover." "You are a coward," Alara rasped, her throat dry and aching. She glared at him, refusing to let him see the sheer, paralyzing terror consuming her soul. She thought of Julian, bleeding out on the cold concrete of his own basement, and a profound, burning hatred ignited in her chest. "You hide behind mercenaries and blood money because you are entirely empty. You can burn the veil. You can kill me, but the FBI already has the banking records. They have the communication logs. You are a hunted animal, Marcus, and you will die in a cage." Marcus's face twitched, the arrogant mask slipping for a fraction of a second to reveal the panicked, cornered rat underneath. He stood up abruptly, kicking the heavy wooden chair away with a violent curse. He reached into his overcoat and pulled out a large, heavy plastic canister of industrial's accelerant. "Your defiance is tedious," Marcus sneered, unscrewing the cap of the canister. He began to splash the highly flammable liquid in a wide circle around the rusted pipe she was chained to, the harsh, chemical fumes instantly burning her nostrils. "Julian is dead. The syndicate is mine once I re-establish contact with the European buyers. In 10 minutes, this warehouse will be a raging inferno, and the great mystery of my sister-in-law's death will be reduced to ash, along with your bones. I am going to the harbor to secure my transport. Bruno will wait outside to ensure the fire finishes its job. Goodbye, Miss Vance." Marcus did not linger for a dramatic, villainous monologue. He unscrewed the cap of his polished silver lighter, striking the flint. This a flame flickered in the cold, damp air with a casual, deeply cruel flick of his wrist. He tossed the bursting lighter onto the concrete floor just outside the circle of accelerant. The flame caught immediately. A brilliant, roaring ring of fire ignited around Alara, the intense heat instantly searing her exposed skin. Marcus turned his back on the flames, picking up the golden veil, and walked out of the warehouse, the heavy steel doors echoing with a devastating finality as they locked from the outside. Alara panicked, thrashing violently against the iron chains. The zip ties bit deeply into her wrists, drawing blood as she desperately pulled with all her strength. The ring of fire was slowly creeping inward, feeding on the damp debris and ancient dust of the warehouse floor. The smoke was beginning to thicken, stinging her eyes and choking her lungs. She was going to burn to death. She was going to die alone in the dark. And Marcus Thorne was going to walk away free. But as the flames crept closer, reflecting in her terrified eyes, a sudden sharp memory cut through her panic. She remembered sitting in the East Wing laboratory, meticulously weaving the pure gold silk thread into the veil. She remembered breaking a specialized, highly durable gold alloy wire, a rigid, unbreakable filament used to structure the heavier lacework. She had absent-mindedly tucked a 3-inch piece of the rigid gold wire into the hem of her dress to throw away later, so it wouldn't scratch the delicate antique fabric on her work table. Alara's breath hitched. She twisted her body, ignoring the searing heat of the approaching flames, and frantically ran her bound hands along the side seam of her ruined silk dress. Her fingers brushed against a tiny, sharp point poking through the fabric. She ripped the gold wire out of the seam. It was thick, rigid, and incredibly strong. With trembling, blood-slicked fingers, Alara maneuvered the rigid gold wire into the small, rectangular locking mechanism of the industrial zip ties binding her wrists. She had spent 20 years manipulating microscopic threads with unparalleled precision. She knew exactly how to find the tension point. She jammed the wire under the locking tooth, pressing down with all her remaining strength while simultaneously violently yanking her wrists apart. With a sharp, plastic snap, the zip ties broke. Alara scrambled away from the rusted pipe, rolling frantically across the dirty concrete to escape the encroaching circle of fire. She coughed violently, her lungs burning from the toxic smoke, but she was free. She scrambled to her feet, looking around the cavernous, burning warehouse. She needed a weapon. She needed a way out. Her eyes landed on a dusty, forgotten workbench in the corner of the room. Sitting atop a pile of rotting crates was a massive, antiquated ham radio unit, its heavy antenna pointing toward the skylights. The antique shop below used to use it to coordinate illegal offshore shipments. Alara ran to the radio, her fingers flying across the dials. She flicked the power switch. Miraculously, the green light on the console flickered to life. She grabbed the heavy microphone, twisting the frequency dial to the Universal Emergency Broadcast Channel. "Mayday, this is a blind distress signal," Alara screamed into the microphone, coughing violently as the smoke grew thicker. "My name is Alara Vance. I am trapped inside the abandoned harbor warehouse in the North End. Marcus Thorne is here. He is fleeing via the harbor. Send the FBI, send everyone." She dropped the microphone, grabbing a heavy, rusted iron crowbar from the workbench. She turned toward the heavy steel doors of the warehouse, preparing to fight her way out through the flames. But before she could take a single step, the deafening roar of a massive engine echoed outside. The heavy steel doors of the warehouse didn't just open. They were violently, catastrophically blown off their hinges. A heavily armored, pitch-black SUV smashed completely through the entrance, crushing the flaming debris beneath its massive tires. The vehicle skidded to a violent halt in the center of the warehouse. The driver's side door was kicked open, and Julian Thorns stepped out into the smoke. He looked like a resurrected god of war. His chest and shoulder were heavily wrapped in thick, blood-soaked bandages, his left arm strapped tightly to his torso. He was deathly pale, clearly running on nothing but pure, unadulterated adrenaline and a sheer, terrifying force of will that defied all medical logic. In his right hand, he held a massive, high-caliber tactical shotgun. Behind him, dozens of heavily armed loyalists swarmed into the warehouse. neutralizing Bruno and the remaining mercenaries outside in a matter of seconds. Julian, Elara screamed, dropping the crowbar and running through the smoke, throwing herself into his arms. Julian dropped the shotgun, his massive, uninjured arm wrapping around her waist and crushing her against his chest. He buried his face in her smoke-filled hair, letting out a ragged, agonizing breath that sounded like a sob. I have you. I have you. You are safe. He went to the docks, Elara cried, pointing frantically toward the rear exit of the warehouse. He took the veil. Julian's eyes darkened. The lethal, terrifying predator returning in an instant. He gently pushed Elara behind him, into the protective circle of his armed guards. He picked up his shotgun, racking a shell into the chamber with a single, brutal motion of his good arm. He walked straight through the smoke and kicked open the rear doors, leading to the harbor docks. The freezing rain and howling wind of the storm whipped across the wooden piers. Marcus Thorne was standing at the end of the dock, desperately trying to start the engine of a sleek, high-speed offshore smuggling boat. When he heard the doors crash open, he spun around, his eyes widening in sheer, primal horror as he saw his nephew walking toward him like an unkillable ghost. Julian did not run. He walked with a slow, deliberate, terrifyingly calm cadence, the heavy boots echoing against the wet wood. Marcus drew a small pistol from his overcoat and fired wildly, but his hands were shaking too violently. The bullets went wide, splashing harmlessly into the dark water. Julian reached the end of the pier. With a sudden, explosive burst of speed, he swung the heavy wooden stock of the shotgun directly into Marcus's jaw. The sickening crunch of bone echoed over the storm. Marcus collapsed onto the wet wooden planks, dropping his gun and the golden veil. Julian stepped forward, placing his heavy combat boots squarely on Marcus's chest, pinning the monster to the pier. He aimed the massive barrel of the shotgun directly at Marcus's face. His finger tightened around the trigger. 20 years of grief, pain, betrayal, and unyielding rage culminated in this single, violent fraction of a second. The world demanded that blood be paid with blood. The mafia boss was ready to execute his final judgment. Do it, Marcus spat blood onto the pier, glaring up at his nephew with a twisted, psychotic defiance. Shoot me, Julian. Pull the trigger and prove that you are exactly the monster I trained you to be. Prove that you are no better than me. Julian's jaw clenched, a muscle jumping in his cheek as the adrenaline raged through his veins. He pressed the barrel harder against Marcus's forehead. Julian, stop. Elara's voice cut through the howling wind and the roaring storm. She ran down the wooden pier, completely ignoring the armed guards. She didn't look at Marcus. She looked directly into Julian's steel-gray eyes. Look at me, Julian, Elara pleaded, her voice breaking with desperate, profound emotion. Do not let him do this to you. Do not let him drag you down into his darkness. Your mother begged you to protect your soul. I am begging you to protect your soul. If you pull that trigger, he wins. He turns into a murderer. Choose the light. Please, choose us. Julian stared at the woman he loved. He looked at her smoke-stained face, her ruined dress, and the fierce, unyielding light of humanity burning in her eyes. He heard the distant, rapidly approaching wail of dozens of police and FBI sirens screaming through the city, responding to Elara's ham radio broadcast. The internal war raged for one final, agonizing second. And then the dark knight surrendered his sword. Julian's slowly pulled his finger off the trigger. He lowered the shotgun, stepping off Marcus's chest. He reached down, picking up the kintsugi veil from the wet wooden planks, cradling the golden threads against his chest. He turned his back on his uncle forever, walking straight into Elara's arms. 10 seconds later, a swarm of heavily armed FBI agents swarmed the pier, tackling a screaming, humiliated Marcus Thorne to the ground and dragging him away in heavy iron chains. The cycle of violence had finally been broken. 6 months later, the afternoon sun poured through the massive stained glass windows of the historic Trinity Church in Copley Square, bathing the sanctuary in a warm, brilliant, golden light. The atmosphere was entirely different from the suffocating, toxic elite gathering of Alara's past. The pews were filled with genuine friends, the world's most respected art historians, the dedicated lawyers of Evelyn Cross's firm, and the families whose lives had been saved by the newly established Rosalind Thorne Foundation. Julian Thorne stood at the altar. He was no longer the terrifying shadow of the Boston underworld. He wore a stunning classic tuxedo, his posture relaxed, his steel-gray eyes radiating a profound, unshakable peace. He had successfully dismantled his entire criminal empire, transitioning his vast wealth into a legitimate charity that provided relentless legal protection for the vulnerable. He had traded his empire of fear for a legacy of hope. The soft, beautiful chords of a string quartet began to play. The heavy wooden doors of the sanctuary opened. Alara Vance walked down the aisle. She did not wear a designer gown bought with old money. She wore a dress she had designed and sewn with her own brilliant hands, elegant and entirely unique. And trailing behind her, shimmering brilliantly in the sunlight, was the masterpiece. The kintsugi veil. The pure gold threads wove a story of survival, resilience, and unimaginable beauty across the antique ivory lace. Walking beside her, his arm linked tightly with hers, was Oliver. He bore a faint, healing scar across his forehead, a proud testament to his own survival, and he beamed with tears in his eyes as he proudly gave his best friend away. When Alara reached the altar, Julian stepped forward. He didn't care about the hundreds of guests watching them. He reached out, his large, gentle hands lifting the golden veil. He looked into the eyes of the woman who had saved his soul. They proved that human beings, much like antique lace, can be violently torn apart by the cruelty of the world. The wealthy, the corrupt, and the arrogant may try to shred our dignity with their power, but with profound empathy, fierce equality, and the unyielding courage to respect one another, we can sew the broken pieces back together. The wounds we suffer do not dictate our worth, and our scars do not define our ruin. If we are brave enough to fill those wounds with love and truth, they become the golden threads of our ultimate survival. As the golden afternoon sun fades on Julian and Alara's wedding day, the final chapter of their turbulent journey comes to a close, leaving us with an echoing silence that demands profound reflection. This is not merely a story about a ruthless mafia boss and a working-class artisan. It is a raw, unflinching exploration of human dignity, the poisons of elitism, and the sheer, unyielding power of redemption. At the very heart of this narrative lies the magnificent Japanese philosophy of kintsugi, the ancient art of repairing what is broken with pure gold. Throughout our lives, the world will inevitably try to tear us apart. We will all encounter people like the Kensington family, individuals so bankrupt in their own souls that they use their wealth, privilege, and cruel entitlement to shred the dreams of those they deem beneath them. They operate under the delusion that power is the ability to humiliate the vulnerable. But Alara Vance stands as a towering testament to the truth that a person's absolute worth is never dictated by their bank account, the pedigree of their bloodline, or their social status. True dignity cannot be bought, and it certainly cannot be destroyed by a pair of sewing shears. By pinning that violently ruined lace into her hair and walking down the aisle with her head held high, Alara taught us a vital lesson. We must never shrink ourselves to make our abusers comfortable. We must never hide our wounds to protect the fragile egos of those who hurt us. Parallel to Alara's fierce defiance is Julian Thorne's monumental internal war, reminding us that the greatest battles we fight are often within ourselves. Julian represents the darkest, most bruised parts of the human condition. He was a man molded by extreme trauma, raised in a criminal underworld that celebrated violence and rewarded absolute ruthlessness. For 2 decades, he was a prisoner to his own justified hatred, relentlessly hunting the ghosts of his past. When the ultimate betrayal was revealed, when he discovered that the uncle who raised him was the very monster who murdered his mother, the universe handed Julian the perfect excuse to become exactly what society expected him to be. He could have pulled that trigger on the storm-battered pier. He could have bathed in the blood of his enemy and claimed his brutal vengeance. But the profound lesson Julian offers us is that true. Earth-shattering strength is not found in the destruction of our enemies. True power is the supreme courage required to break the cycle of generational violence. We are not the sins of our ancestors. We are not permanently bound by the toxic environments that shaped us, nor are we required to inherit the hatred of the past. By lowering his unsaz weapon and choosing the justice of the law over the executioner's bullet, Julian proved that even a soul forged in the absolute darkest fires of hell can choose the light. He chose humanity over vengeance. He chose love over fear. Ultimately, the story of the golden scars reminds us that no matter how violently we are torn apart by the cruelty, betrayal, or unfairness of this world, our ruin is never final. The wounds we carry do not make us worthless. They are simply the empty spaces waiting to be filled with the gold of empathy, self-respect, and compassion. When we refuse to let hatred consume us, and when we treat one another with the fundamental human equality we all inherently deserve, we weave our own golden threads into the fabric of our lives. We become breathtaking masterpieces, undeniably more beautiful, complex and resilient precisely because we have been broken and survived. This story is a timeless promise that light can always be found at the end of the darkest corridors, as long as we have the courage to walk through the fire together and honor the scars that made us who we are. This content was researched, developed, and manually edited by us to bring meaning and valuable lessons.